Genre is a nebulous term that doesn't do a very good job at encapsulating what it's supposed to represent, which is why we, as the fervent consumers, are forced to rely on subgenres to glean some specificity and find something we can more reliably connect with as a piece of entertainment. Horror is as broad as a genre could possibly be. There are so many distinct flavors and deviations in that umbrella term that its own subgenres are well developed enough to possess their own set of subcategories to apply further distinction. There's psychological horror games, survival horror games, and this video's topic, horror FPS games. You'd think that being able to wield and point a gun would get in the way of all the scares, but I never felt that to be an issue. The radical immersion that the first-person perspective allows often amplifies those feelings significantly. These games strike a commendable balance between providing the anxiety of a proper horror experience while also sporting satisfying gameplay to satiate the parts of our brains that revel in action only found in escapism. Ever since the very dawn of the shooter genre, it's always rubbed shoulders with horror elements, and every so often they'd meet down the aisle and marry the concepts together and consummate some genre-defining titles. What I seek to do is to honor this funny little horror FPS genre by taking a close look at some of its more iconic examples, as well as some lesser-known one and indie titles, to examine their unique approaches to the genre and see how they hold up today. Some of these games I'm quite familiar with, while others I'm playing for the first time. There are plenty of surreal or creepy adventure games set in the first person, but I don't quite remember being able to shoot people in Seventh Guest. The only stipulations present are that these games have to be some type of horror presenting and feature explicit combat. Other than that, it's a free-for-all. Given the gargantuan amount of examples this genre can provide, this is inherently not a comprehensive video that will cover every single example. I'm well aware I'm likely missing key titles, so I'll do my best to round up whatever examples people will angrily suggest in the comments section for a belated part 2. Though the version of this video you're seeing on YouTube is abridged. The Patreon-only version is longer because I'm covering a few additional games there exclusively, and I've also made some bonus videos if you're interested. This is all available through the Jawcoin tier subscription, and the names you see on screen are the loyal supporters who make these videos possible in the first place. If I asked you, what was the real first horror shooter? Most people are going to say Doom, and really, they aren't wrong to do so, but I always saw Doom as more of an action thriller that had the violence and hell imagery as elements of the setting rather than something outwardly trying to make the player feel afraid. It's all about presentation, so I'm not going to be talking about Doom, at least for now. And come on, who's the franchise?
I live again.
Blood might not be the absolute first example of a horror FPS game, but it's the one that really put this subgenre on the map, and it's not hard to see why. I want to dedicate a significant portion of this video towards Monolith Productions, because they made more than a few horror FPS games that stand the test of time and embody the genre better than anything else, and in the wake of their tragic 2025 closure, they deserve some recognition. id Software made the full proper jump into the third dimension with 96's Quake, but there is a curious in-between era betwixt the Doom and Quake engines, Ken Silverman's Build engine, with its famous 2.5D look of 2D sprites and 3D environments producing some of the most iconic games not just of its era, but in the entire genre. Duke Nukem 3D was inarguably the most famous game on the engine, but it was only one member of a Trimurti that defined it, with Shadow Warrior and Blood being the other two. But Blood was completely distinct from its sister titles for a few important reasons. It was originally developed by a subsidiary of 3D Realms, then bought by Monolith. This game was actually the company's first, and arguably its most important game. It was also published by the psychopaths at GT Interactive, but we'll talk about them later. The title of the game gives up the ghost. It's settled somewhere between Dollar Store Halloween section and Cult Ritual Gone Wrong, giving it an incredibly strong and memorable aesthetic that's remained shockingly timeless even in 2026. The broad trend of FPS game visuals at the time was all chips in on sci-fi. Not that there weren't outliers and deviations, but that's generally what popular shooter games looked like for the entire decade in some shape or form. Blood was completely unconcerned with following trends and took a secret, less traveled path instead, something that's clearly reflected in every facet of its gameplay and visuals, like looking down into a puddle of spilled. There's some serious effort to forge a quiet atmosphere. Blood can be contemplative when it wants. Its soundtrack is almost entirely ambient and knows its place as set dressing for the excellent sound design. Everything just sounds crunchy and brutal. The screams of the damned and hissing of your guns mix to make a particularly ghoulish audio experience. The gothic gargoyles on our HUD, our weaponry being a mix of pedestrian farming tools and arcane objects, pools of melted flesh and bones are commonplace as they are grotesque, which is very. Journeying through the cursed, occult world of blood feels unsightly in a way that begs us to dive headfirst to see what the game has to offer, to look for its treasures, which you'll always find because Blood has some of the best kept secret items and levels in the medium. The gothic 20th century setting defines every location in ways both grand and subtle. Stone cathedrals, old cities, unexplored caverns. Every area containing some semblance of human life or society feels deeply corrupted and wrong. The devil is absolutely the prince of this earth, but perhaps that gives you more incentive to blast people's faces in. The build engine really helps the game's textures pop, with locations like old haunted chateaus and fleshy nightmare realms equally rendered in all their sticky splendor. It's not that other build engine games didn't look good, far from it, but in terms of pure qualitative art direction, Blood is the apex. Every weapon you hold and enemy you fire them at are unmistakably unique. You see these guys, you think of Blood, nothing else. Well, maybe Heretic, but don't worry about that. Not to mention all the references to horror films and literature. Oh my goodness, there are so many references, both small and large, it'll make your head spin. I don't recall Blood having an astounding budget for its era, but CGI cutscenes were still included before and after each chapter. And they certainly are cutscenes, alright. The grim disposition and bifurcated tongue-in-cheek tone all culminates in our magnificent protagonist, Caleb. This guy is an absolute riot. Without doubt, he's the still beating heart and undead soul of Blood. Caleb is very much a wisecracking, sarcastic badass, but he's not on any virtuous mission to save the planet or even a single life. The whole story is a dead simple revenge tale of how Caleb was betrayed by the very monstrous deity he worshipped, Chernobog, with Caleb rising from the grave just to blow his old boss's head off out of spite for stealing his girl and killing his buddies. Caleb is just as, if not more, supernatural than his foes, if rising from the grave wasn't a clear enough indicator. He's some kind of quasi-immortal Western gunslinger who can consume the hearts of the living to regain health. He is sadistic, cruel, and genuinely delights in inflicting suffering on the innocents, but that makes him all the more fitting in a world as tormented as this. He's a hero by circumstance, not choice. His one-liners are arguably the cheesiest and silliest of his era, but Stefan Wyatt's buttery smooth, Saturday morning cartoon villain-like delivery carries the kind of gusto and confidence that reminds you that everything you liked when you were 12 is still cool.
Is that gasoline I smell? You have to have faith for that to work. That's all, folks. They're all dead. They just don't know it yet.
It casts aside all teenage doubt and lets you revel in being an edgelord like greeting an old friend. Blood does away with a lot of traditional weaponry found in the genre and gives us an incredibly diverse and varied kit to play around with, which all have unique effects, uses, and applications to make combat feel consistently fresh and rewarding, in theory. I don't think I'm going to be making any friends by saying this, but Blood's arsenal is very all over the place for me. Don't get me wrong, everything here is useful in some form, but I would not call it balanced whatsoever. Some weapons have multiple uses, while others have one really niche one that simply doesn't compare with the rest. We start with a melee-only pitchfork, the most traditional weapon the game has, and it sucks. I don't mean it sucks just because it's melee, it sucks because it does dick all damage. It takes like 8 hits for the most piddling enemies to die. It's really not all that useful. Instead of getting a traditional hit scan pistol, we get this big bulky flare gun, which shoots a projectile that sticks into a foe and operates on an invisible timer that sets things on fire with a stylish sprite if that enemy's health is depleted by the time it's done. This means that your bloodlust might have to take a backseat to your patience. Since there's no way to tell when your opponent is close to death until they suddenly burst into flame, I found it more useful to use in conjunction with other weapons rather than a solo slayer. You fire a flare before or after riddling someone with bullets. It's quite good for dealing with weaker enemies, but I wouldn't advise pulling it out when you're being rushed down or facing something strong. It also introduces us to the concept of the alt fire, pressing the right mouse button instead of the left for an alternate effect. The flare gun's alt fire shoots a spread shot of flares. It kicks ass. Caleb's shotty has to be in the top 5 of all video game shotguns ever made. There's no trick or gimmick, it's just a 2-barrel shotty that shoots as fast as you can click it. and Alt-Fire shoots both barrels at once. Without question, this is Caleb's best close-range weapon. You'll be using this for nearly every single encounter because of how tight the bullet spread is and how it scales the damage the closer you are. Hit and run and just funneling all your focus on one foe are both valid strategies. Maps are tight, so blindly firing this into a room is nearly guaranteed to not only do damage, but a lot of it. The Tommy gun is your next staple, and I really hope you understand that it's just a Tommy gun. You shoot, but you shoot fast. Alt-Fire has Caleb wave the thing around like Frank Vincent, which works well in a pinch when a bunch of thangs are up in your grill, but stick to the left mouse button when aiming down sights. The napalm launcher isn't quite a rocket launcher, but it's a rocket launcher. Does wicked damage and has a surprisingly small explosion radius, so this thing is a marvel at mid-range for tougher foes. Alt-Fire's weird ball projectile is not worth it, however. Very clunky and obtuse. But now, Blood's most iconic and instrumental weapon, TNT. Oh my god, I cannot overstate how important this throwable is to this game's identity and gameplay. Firstly, bundles of this are everywhere, so make use of it as much as humanly possible. I cannot overstate that enough. Aside from just exploding with a range that can hurt you if you're too close to it, you can charge it for a full second to control its distance once thrown, but it simply goes where your cursor goes, so there's a learning curve to this explosive, but the on-demand damage and pure availability of this item are dramatically bigger upsides, because a lot of the tankier enemies in this game basically require you to use this item with their big fat health bars. Alt-firing has you place it straight down to act as a trap, which sometimes works, but not enough for me to remember it exists. It reveals how bulky most of these underworld creatures are, but serves as a reminder that Caleb still lives in a Looney Tunes-esque world of comic capital V violence. There are some variants of the TNT found in the proximity and remote detonation types. I never found these super useful because enemies tend to stick to their perch and don't wander far, unless they're the kinds that directly chase you. So trying to lure most of them somewhere or plant traps in general isn't worthless, but vastly outclassed by just blasting them in the face. The flamethrower is some hot cross buns, deals very unimpressive damage for how close you need to be to use it, and the fire doesn't stun most enemies. So you're going to set yourself on fire and get shot before anything resembling good results come from this. Stay away unless you're desperate on ammo. The Tesla cannon is another big one. A semi-automatic laser weapon that shoots a plasma volley within about half-a-second intervals that deals consistently good damage, but drains ammo like a mother. I honestly have no idea what the Alt-Fire does because I literally never used it. How does he have plasma weapons in the 1920s? Don't worry about it. The Life Leech and Voodoo Doll look amazing, but I really couldn't stand using either of them for a single moment. The Voodoo Doll relies on your cursor being kept on a single foe to deal continuous damage, or else hurt yourself, and keeping your cursor on a single shucking foe is demandingly precise, which makes one of the only long-range options Caleb has a very inconsistent one. Not that it matters, because there aren't that many long-range encounters in the whole game. And the Life Leech is honestly one of the worst weapons I've ever attempted to use in any FPS. It's a gnarly skull scepter that launches semi-automatic fireballs, but these fireballs are slow, take up a ton of screen real estate, and hardly deal any damage. There's hardly any ammo for this thing, so why would you ever want to use it? That is beyond me. You can see the variety from the start, but unfortunately, Blood is an exceptionally comfortable game when you only use the shotgun, Tommy gun, and dynamite for 90% of it. The napalm launcher and Tesla gun have definitive uses, but this trifecta is without question the winning strategy for literally every single encounter in the game so long as you have the ammo, which makes everything else feel like a backup plan and not a fully realized tool in your kit. This isn't to imply that Caleb is some slouch, certainly not. Blood's gameplay is some of the fastest and most chaotic out of any shooter, because despite the man himself being lightning quick in movement and in firing, your ammo and health can be depleted so fast you'll say, "How did I die? What hit me?" So using his, quite frankly, absurd ground speed alongside jumping and ducking is absolutely essential. Battles begin and end within a single heartbeat, so weapon switching is mandatory to not getting your skull blasted open instantly, because being sloppy is a guaranteed death. Good grief, Blood is one of the hardest FPS games I've ever played. And it's primarily because the most common enemies are the cloaked cultists who have hit scan machine guns that lock onto you and won't stop firing for love nor money. What this means is that just charging head on without being confident or able to put them down before they fire will get you instantly killed. So every single room of every single map should follow a bang and clear protocol. Quickly assess what to do upon entering and execute the plan as fast as possible to avoid the onslaught of bullets and fireballs. Pick up any health, ammo, or armor you need along the way, and maybe just pray for good luck. Some call this cheap, while some say it's just old school, and these boomer shooter zoomer sissies need to toughen up. I'm somewhere in the middle, because while it's incredibly satisfying to clutch an encounter against a room of cloaked cultists by the skin of your teeth, every room presenting an equal opportunity to kill you in a second when you make a single mistake is bound to make you regret installing the game on occasion. It's one of those games that gives you infinite quick save, so it does not care at all how unfair a certain situation is, so brace yourself for some brutal old school game design. Each enemy operates differently and requires different methods to take down. In theory. Again, shotgun, Tommy gun, dynamite, that's all you need. But no word of a lie, some of these guys are super annoying because they're fast and wildly spongy. Like, why does a gargoyle need 8 shotgun blasts to the face to kill? So many threats are on the ground or in the air, forcing you to crouch or crane your neck up to try and fail to hit something out of the air. It's such a pain in the ass. If you find the Akimbo power-up, then you can absolutely turn your brain off and blast everything in sight with temporary dual wielding. A very simple but highly rewarding power-up that never overstays its welcome. So much of the combat's flow rests in its map design, because there's almost always multiple passageways to access a single room, so you're not forced to just head forward towards a meat grinder. There's ample room to strategize. Maps in general are incredibly non-linear, sometimes operating as many as, damn, 6 keys? Fuck. Not all levels need 6 keys, but the ones that do can sit on it and spin. Depending on the level, the key system can range from feeling like a fun way to break up the pacing by forcing exploration, or a debilitating nightmare that made me want to throw myself in the oven. This mansion level still haunts my dreams. Boss fights are not the game's strong suit, but also not terrible. They're very much inspired by Doom 2 bosses, where you snake through an arena and fight a single super-powered foe, because facing them head-on is a pretty dumb idea. I am kind of persnickety when it comes to boss fights in FPS games, because sometimes it feels like every other boss is just the cyber demon, or you have to flip some switches while avoiding attacks to win, and you better get used to that in like all these games. This isn't a short game either. Blood's modern releases have a combined 42 levels from the base game plus expansions, which is quite substantial. 100% completing this on the hardest difficulties can easily take you 15 hours. I played on the standard difficulty and won in about 8 without doing any of the expansion packs, which left me more than satisfied. Blood is a game I have a tremendous amount of respect for because of its willingness to discard some tropes and conventions. It really experimented with the medium, but some of what it relies on to function I just plain bounced off of super hard. Throwing TNT and getting lost in levels that are way bigger than they needed to be got a little too repetitive for my liking, and its difficulty can sometimes feel like trying to swallow a mouthful of paprika. I can do it, but it's gonna hurt. A lot. It didn't see nearly as much success as the other 2 members of the Build Engine's Big 3, but it more than made up for it in its cult, pun intended, following. It was a real dark horse in the genre, quietly inspiring a ton of fan wads and fan games. And you know Dusk? The shooter that helped popularize the modern usage of the term boomer shooter, that was basically just a love letter to Blood in its entirety, and putting the 2 side by side shows it pretty demonstrably. Dusk is a game I've spoken of before on this channel, but I wish I really emphasized just how inspired it was by Blood, because Blood being so instrumental in the revival of this older style of game is pretty important to its legacy. Between you and me, Blood is more of a movement shooter than Dusk is, but no one's gonna tell you that. Caleb broke down a lot of walls and was one of the first shooter protagonists to fly around and bounce off the walls, which is what the kids want in a shooter game now. Go through a curated list of modern boomer shooters, guaranteed you'll click on one at least partly or even entirely inspired by Blood. It's in a weird spot these days, where people still debate on which version is the best to play. There's the DOS original, I wouldn't recommend it. It is the purest form of Blood if you get it running in DOSBox, but there are modern options that blow it way out of the water. I played Fresh Supply, a 2019 remaster from Night Dive Studios, which is kind of rough around the edges with some performance issues and minor bugs, but was the most accessible way to play it at the time, and it gave you the original DOS version at a later update. If you have Blood's files from a purchase, original disc, a torrent, there's also NBlood, which asks you to simply copy some game files over to its respective folder. I'd argue that this is the most fan-approved way to play if you're a hardcore enthusiast or old head. And for some reason, Fresh Supply got taken down because Night Dive did another remaster called Refresh Supply in 2025, which looks like a better remaster in every way, having the source code will do that, but asks you to pay an exorbitant price, which should remind you that Night Dive being bought by Atari was a mistake. I'm glad Blood has enough of an audience to keep justifying its relevance on the market, but damn, 40 Canadian bones? No thank you. Blood didn't earn Duke Nukem 3D sales, but it totaled around 100,000 copies sold in a year, which put Monolith on the map and allowed them to continue making and publishing games, this time using their own engine instead of relying on Build. The Build engine is regarded as a timeless piece of history now, but back then, I think people began to see it as antiquated and shy towards the graphics that only a proper three-dimensional world could offer. Sprites were seen as an object of the past to most game developers, with only a few especially staunch Japanese developers refusing to give up on them throughout the late 90s and early 2000s. Monolith made a humble, top-down hack-and-slash called Get Medieval to test the waters, but they were itching to take their games to the third dimension proper, to not be left behind in such a rapidly changing market. They had just finished making their new 3D engine, Lithtech, and were busy making a mech suit game called Shogo, Mobile Armor Division. Shogo is a pretty obscure release that took a ton of inspiration from anime and manga. It actually doesn't look too bad for the time period. It was self-published, which made GT Interactive, their sometimes publisher, quite upset because they got no money from it. Remember, GT held all the publishing rights to Blood, Monolith's golden egg, as a franchise, so they had a huge financial incentive to rub their hands together and start plotting the second the original game hit the shelves. They wanted, nay, demanded, a sequel. They essentially held Monolith at gunpoint to create one. I don't mean they requested a sequel in a get around to it after whatever you're currently working on way. I mean, you have 11 months to make this, or we're setting off a gas leak in the building kind of way, and I'm only slightly exaggerating. The entire studio was sent into a panicked frenzy the second they received the news. Monolith were only just beginning to understand the capabilities of their own engine, still in the midst of making a game with it, and now they were suddenly thrust with the responsibility of not only making a sequel to a fan-favorite shooter game, they had to make the sequel to a fan-favorite shooter game in less than a year from scratch on a new engine. They genuinely had no ideas, no plans, absolutely nothing to build off of. As if the company wasn't satisfied with being thrown under the bus just once, Monolith co-founder Jace Hall decided to ask the fans of Blood on internet forums what they wanted to see in Blood 2, which is like getting run over by said bus, getting back up, and then throwing yourself underneath the next bus on the same route. It's completely masochistic behavior. Monolith was split down the middle working on Shogo and Blood 2 at the same time. Just look at these release dates. My word. I hope this backstory does an adequate enough job to explain why Blood 2 is genuinely one of the most disappointing sequels I have ever had the misfortune of playing. It's fighting for scraps in the alleyway with Postal 3 and Enter the Dragonfly. I'm not kidding either. I'm actually really mad. Every second I spent on Blood 2 The Chosen feels like getting my ass sliced with a straight razor. Just getting the game to run is a challenge in itself. Monolith, despite being a foremost PC game developer, makes video games that simply do not function correctly on modern computers on a scale never before seen. You can buy the game on Steam or GOG, but neither version works. What happens when you click the game's launcher is that it launches in 640p, which I'm not playing because it's not 1998 anymore. But trying to upscale the game to 1980 by 1080 makes the game completely unable to load any levels or work past the main menu. It also loves to crash, like all the time, which means my footage can only be reliably recorded in short chunks and at a geeked up resolution I had to manually edit and post, so don't say I don't work hard for you, brothers and sisters. You have to install a fan-made patch in order to get the game running as intended, which is genuinely unbelievable. How was this game allowed to be sold on modern platforms in a state this broken is a question you'll be hearing a lot with this company. But unlike Monolith's other games, Blood 2 is ostensibly not worth the trouble to get it running. The original Blood had a superb aesthetic, blending gothic horror with 20th century Americana to compete with chocolate and peanut butter in a combinations that just feel right contest. While Blood 2 decided to make a pivot so jarring it beats whatever Ye is doing at this particular moment. Blood 2 bursts on the stage with a sci-fi aesthetic so impressively generic it looks like a fake video game Spencer from iCarly would play on the TV. All those haunting streets and blood-soaked dungeons you loved and admired, gone, replaced with neon-dabbed cities and science labs so astonishingly unremarkable you could genuinely be anywhere in the world. I'm hesitant to say these locations look outright awful because I can think of many other games set in such plain locales, but Blood ran with such a strong style compared to the Chosen's choice of stripping away the series' distinct look so thoroughly that it feels deliberate. Because it was. Blood 2 takes place in 2028, a century after the first game, which is an interesting idea, but there was no time to flesh out that creative choice beyond making it. Generic mooks in black suits, guys in power armor, Caleb looks dumb. All of your weapons feel like Monolith just applied lip gloss to the first few weapons someone thinks of when they hear design a video game character's arsenal. Sandblasting the previous game's looks feels so much more grievous because what they've replaced it with is nothing. Yeah, it's sci-fi. Put a screen on the Uzi for some reason, let the player figure that one out. If they absolutely had to set this game in an American city, why not lean into a specific choice? We could have had a neo-gothic New Orleans or a techie Boulder, Colorado. And just something to make the game betray the fact that its development cycle was shorter than a cycle of laundry. I would take Cleveland, Ohio. That's how desperate I am.
You can see the fish are dead. The fish don't want to live in Cleveland.
Blood tried so hard to go against the grain, and then got completely suffocated by said grain the second time around, which pleases no one. It doesn't have any kind of edge or uniqueness to it. You can tell you're looking at Shadow Warrior when you see it. You can tell you're looking at Duke Nukem when you see it. But Blood 2 looks like everything you've ever seen before reheated, like a $1 burrito. Dig in. It's getting big leagued by exploding lips in the visual department. That's tough. There's hardly any background details or horror references. I feel like if I try to explore, I'll fall into blue hell. If I had to play Chernobog's advocate, the sci-fi twist could have worked if it incorporated that Spirit Halloween vibe and art direction. But I guess they didn't feel like doing that. Not that they would have had the time to. I can't ignore the fact that the game's 3D doesn't do it any favors, putting it kindly. The character models simply look bad. Worse than Turok in the N64, and Turok holds up quite a bit more than this. Obviously the team had no time to polish anything, so I'll cut them a lot of slack for this game looking like you found it in a cereal box, but good art direction could have subtly masked a lot of the aesthetic blemishes, and this game doesn't have bad direction, but none at all. Can you honestly tell me what they were going for? Because I can't tell you, and I don't think Monolith could either. So the game looks bad, but don't worry, it also plays bad too. Blood is a game that demands you bounce off the walls and weigh the impact of each click on your mouse using knee-jerk reaction time and split-second decision-making. Blood 2 completely guts Caleb's moveset and allows for only the most rudimentary shooting and movement the genre can give you. Caleb jogs rather than sprints, which removes jumping and crouching from the combat equation altogether, so your only way to engage in combat is just to fire as fast as you can and slowly circle around enemies as much as possible. So treat everyone like Mr. I in Mario 64, and you're good. Blood 2 still has an overwhelming amount of hit-scan enemies, so I'm tempted to say it encourages a cover shooter mentality from the very start. To compensate, enemies drop health at a much higher rate than the first game. It's just emptying a clip into something, taking completely unavoidable damage, unless you peek from behind a wall a dozen times, and then slurping up these hearts. Even the guns in your hands are under the universal trance of the sloga spell the entire product fell prone to. Your slugs feel sluggish, your bullets bumbling. I can't even think of any more alliterative terms. Everything feels bad to fire and makes me weep for what we once had. Caleb's undead status didn't hinder him from bouncing around like a rubber ball prior, but maybe after another century he's finally become an old man. incapable of doing anything more than threateningly jogging at people with twin guns he found behind a bulk barn dumpster. It already stings that everything is so generic. Berettas, shotgun, rifles, maybe a plasma tech weapon or two. But they also seem to deal very little direct damage to anything, so enemy sponginess is worse in the sequel. Every weapon also fulfills the same basic purpose of point and shoot. There's no strategy involved with what you choose at any particular moment. Everything moves so slowly that whatever flawed balance the original had is completely broken and overtaken by the malaise of everything blending into each other stat-wise. There are no neurons required for this one. It's as mindless as it gets. I felt no satisfaction or sadistic thrill while killing anything, since there's no opportunity for skill expression or interesting scenarios. Just run through corridors and kill whatever moves. So the combat is bad, the game looks bad, and get this, the game design is even worse. To me, an FPS game being mediocre isn't a decisive deal breaker. I can stomach mediocrity and turn my brain off while I listen to something on YouTube while thoughtlessly clearing rooms of dummies, but I can't recommend you attempt to do this with Blood 2 because it's also bad at being brainless. The maps completely lose their compelling, winding nature and stay strictly linear until they suddenly demand you find a secret exit or location at the drop of Caleb's hat. Which means that level 1 is entirely straightforward until it leads you directly to a dead end and asks you to figure out that jumping on a garbage bin takes you to a narrow alleyway that leads to the rest of the level. The entire game works like this. It's dead simple until it isn't. And because there's no real art direction or thoughtful game design, there's no emphasis on having to shoot a small object to make a path appear, or pull a switch. These things blend into the maps and don't feel or look like active parts of a level necessary for progression. I really did just have to guess where to go a lot of the time. Sometimes I found something, and other times I wandered for far too long. I'm not arguing in favor of slathering this game in yellow paint, but most good games, like The First Blood, made it very apparent when you need to shoot something to make it explode and reveal the way to go because something will obviously look out of place or emphasized. So not having this is extremely noticeable and slaughters the prior cohesion. There's far less key hunting this time around, puzzles are far and few in between, but still present. They're far quicker by virtue of being obviously unfinished, but no one would call them good. They come and go with as little as a whimper, they just make me feel kinda sad. Like watching your senior dog try and jump up on the bed. Blood 2 has a greater emphasis on narrative, with multiple in-game cutscenes to let us follow the confusing and nonsensical journey Caleb must take to defeat the Cabal. Again. And this time, he isn't alone. The Chosen of Blood 2's chosen subtitle are those guys Caleb had to rescue or kill in the first one. Elevated to primary character status with new voices, you have the option to play as any of the 4 characters from the start, who all have individual strengths and weaknesses. I think so, at least. I honestly couldn't tell when I played as them. But only Caleb's story is the real campaign, so everyone else is a bonus. God, this game is on life support. I am shocked it hasn't caused my whole machine to explode. I have a bit of a soft spot for clearly unfinished games that were simply too ambitious for their below-average development cycles, but Blood 2 is no Deadly Premonition or Crash to Insanity. It's not even DMC4. Honestly, I couldn't tell you what this game's story is, and I really don't care to find out, because the game itself seemingly doesn't care what it is. Each level has some flavor text, but I could barely read it. Look how tiny it is. I think each character originally had a unique campaign that told a greater interconnected story, but only Caleb's was ever finished, so what we have left is a mediocre story that barely makes sense. Fantastic! Whether or not the story would have been compelling had it been finished is also up for debate. Kind of a moot point, but the game only works when the whims of fate decides it does. It insists on crashing whenever it wants, flinging enemies around the map, or making them run in place. Almost nothing functions consistently, as intended, or even at an acceptable level of jank. So you might as well flip a coin between the game is running properly and 5 seconds from soft-locking you. Much of this is due to running on newer hardware, but this is still an improvement to how the game worked at launch, as people who purchased it day one can attest to. I really can't overestimate how much of a total failure this entire game is. It's easier to analyze what doesn't work instead of what does, because nothing works. It's not often I find a video game where there is genuinely almost nothing to like about it, where nearly every attempt to be a video game in its mechanics, design, and implementation are so mind-shatteringly, catastrophically bad that its classification as a piece of entertainment feels like a prank. Is it really a matter of preference when it's this bad? Can you actually classify this as entertainment? I think it fails at a fundamental skew level. Well, maybe I'm being too harsh. Believe it or not, there are actually some things I happen to like about Blood 2. Some things I enjoyed very much even. For starters, Caleb is still very much Caleb, cracking jokes with his classic morbid sense of humor and mumbling to himself whenever you sit still.
Fly me to the moon and let me sing among the gore.
In fact, the audio and sound design of this entire game is genuinely fantastic. Weapons sound as they should, and there are still traces of expertly crafted ambience within the subtly melancholic soundtrack that plays throughout. I don't like the monsters in this game as much as the first, but a few of them are about on par with a lesser Silent Hill, which is still high praise. Blood 2 completely lacks any kind of aura, not because the team wanted to exclude it altogether, but because the game is genuinely incapable of expressing it no matter how hard it tries. The jank of this product is so overwhelming that it supersedes any attempt at being scary, or sewing a vibe together that can be remotely described as horror. I'm under no impression that Monolith wanted to release such a frustrating, broken game. They simply had to do what their psychotic publisher told them to do, which includes not getting any additional money or development time to try and save Blood 2, despite their pleas for such things. So much of the game's mediocrity is easily explainable, and even understandable, but that doesn't make it not terrible. There are plenty of great and even amazing games made in a similar time frame that, despite their poor technical states, are still carried by fundamentally good game design choices. Blood 2 lacks any kind of hook or incentive to play. It's rotten down to the core. I really feel bad for all the poor programmers having to slave and crunch over this game, but even if it functioned as intended and had no overwhelming technical blemishes, I still think the core concept was inherently mediocre, so there was nothing they could do but embrace a middling review score. They would have had to start over from scratch to make this game good, in my opinion. GT Interactive refused to let them do a console port or really fix the game beyond publishing an expansion pack because they were in the process of being bought out by another company, which means GT Interactive pulled a devious lick on Monolith by squeezing blood out of a stone through forcing a rush sequel to a good game and then dipping. Told you these guys were scumbags. So while Monolith publicly accepted the lion's share of the blame, which is something I really admire, I ultimately believe the faults lie on GT. But don't worry, they got what was coming to them. Also, that expansion pack I mentioned is even worse than the original game. It was made as a sort of apology expansion. It brought back a lot of old enemies and classic maps, which means the hit-scan wizards are back and are borderline impossible to deal with this time around. Go figure. I honestly couldn't even finish the game. But do you really blame me? Surprising no one, Blood 2 bombed critically and financially, but Monolith was not dismayed. Not even a little bit. Thankfully, the company continued to release games, many of which were self-published, but perhaps they learned to love the feeling of being strangled because once they left their first abusive publisher, they shacked up with one that was way, way worse. But we will get to you when we get to you. Monolith decided to lean all the way into sci-fi, but now they were actually capable of designing games at a reasonable pace without GT breathing down their necks. For their efforts, they earned a fairly large audience with No One Lives Forever, a 1960s parody spy thriller series that got several sequels, and a few spin-off games. A Tron FPS, an Alien vs. Predator game. There are actually a ton of Alien vs. Predator games, I probably need to look into that. And even an MMO for the Matrix? They continued to polish their Lithtech engine for each new release until it became a powerhouse that was staring the Quake and Gold Source engines for Quake and Half-Life in the face. Monolith had really begun to live up to their namesake as an immovable titan of the industry, with the 2000s being graced with not just one, but two astounding releases that changed the genre forever: F.E.A.R. and Condemned: Criminal Origins. I'll be focusing on the F.E.A.R. franchise for now, since Condemned barely has any shooting in it, but I have plans for Condemned in the future. As I've hinted, F.E.A.R. is yet another game with an astoundingly broken PC port. Buying the game is already tedious because Monolith made a catastrophic mistake in allowing Warner Brothers to publish F.E.A.R. through their acquisition of Sierra Games. So their purchasability through Steam was only possible through buying all the games for one inflated price in a bundle for a long time. GOG is where you want to go if you insist on playing on the PC. But be prepared for the game to run below 20 FPS FPS the entire way through. How does one fix this? By disabling one of the human interface devices. One of your USB ports, basically. I'm not making that up. When I was a teenager, I disabled one out of sheer morbid curiosity and desperation. No idea which port that was. And the game shot up from a stuttering 5 FPS back to 60. I have absolutely no clue how that fixes it, or what part of the game's code is bugged on modern PCs, but after pulling my hair out with Blood 2, I wanted to deal with broken PC games like I wanted skin cancer. I dug out my old Xbox 360, connected my Elgato, and she works like a charm. The console port isn't quite as polished as the PC release, on older PCs of course, and using a controller for this game is an adjustment for me, but I'd much rather do this than get worked up about PC ports again. Oh, I was playing Ashura's Wrath last time I booted this up. Maybe I should talk about it in the channel one day. Sorry, sidetracked. Let's reel things in a bit. First Encounter Assault Recon is its full title, but F.E.A.R is one of those acronyms that does a better job explaining what it represents rather than its full, unabridged title. Someone unfamiliar with the game might assume it to be a fairly benign Tom Clancy-esque shooter, but even a cursory glance at the game will dispel this notion quite promptly. Monolith returned to its horror shooter roots, but decided to lean firmly into the spectral, psychological realm of J-horror. Japan already borrowed so much from America for the formation of characters like Sadako from the Ring book series and films, which then in turn re-inspired America, culminating in the formation of a Western Ring film series, as well as revitalizing the trope of the small ghostly girl in Alma Wade. This haunted lass's visage stalks Monolith so intently she may as well be its unofficial mascot. Her haunting, bloodied form gives her some notable clout in the Ghostly Girl Club. Well, it's either she's the mascot or broken PC ports are Monolith's mascot. Pick your poison. But rather than F.E.A.R being some kind of haunted house game, it combines elements of science fiction. The basic premise is that you're an elite, faceless soldier trying to hunt down a maniacal, psychic soldier who's gone AWOL with a mind-controlled clone army at his command. The ghostly visions you keep getting of him and Alma start off as set dressing until they spiral and eventually combine with the main narrative. It's a difficult balance to pull off, feeling action-packed and thrilling while also capable of subtlety and atmosphere, but F.E.A.R proves itself to be a master stroke in both regards. Unknown voices gurgling in your comms, doors slamming on their own, the game's supernaturally gifted pacing allows for moments of quiet intrigue and pulse-pounding firefights to happen right after the other, often following each other sequentially without fleecing the tone. You might be playing as a faceless soldier, but the core shooting has far more personality than meets the eye. Iron sights are either extremely limited or non-existent depending on your gun of choice, and the bullet spread forces you to be tactful and cautious when shooting. Every shot matters, even in the standard difficulty. Your assortment of weapons range from very standard pistols and rifles to more experimental ray guns and grenades. But the star of the show is the Spaz 12. It blows everything out of the water like a meteor landing in a pond. Never gets old. You can only loot one type of ammo from an enemy depending on what they were firing at you, so you must be strategic with what you carry and be willing to drop anything that isn't immediately useful, for the most part. Some weapons have more or less infinite ammo with how frequently you find it, like the shotgun and basic pistols, while rocket launcher ammo is so sparse it feels like a miracle to come across any at all. Some weapons have zooming functions to positively devastate whoever they're pointed at, but you don't need to be that careful with each firefight, unless you're on 5 health or fighting those god-awful turrets. Ugh. I applaud this system for forcing players to think fast and never grow too comfortable at any particular moment, but I couldn't help but notice that most of these weapons, barring the rare experimental ones that hardly show up, all feel like slightly modified rifles that accomplish the same task. Some are fully automatic, or burst fire, but the fact remains that almost everything in the game does basically the same job with the same level of expertise and application. I rolled with the Shoddy and SL8 all game in slots 1 and 2, then just rotated whatever was convenient or cool for slot 3 to fill out the inventory. Dump your starting weapons as soon as you get them, avoid the MP3 like the plague, and you're good. I like this system and I'd rather have it than not, but it can feel a little flimsy compared to other games' arsenals and inventory management systems. On the upside, it means that all of F.E.A.R's weapons feel deadly and heavy in my hands, no doubt in part because the game leans so heavily on lean buttons, controlled by keyboard or controller D-pad, allowing you to tilt left or right with your gun out and peek behind corridors or debris to pick off enemy soldiers, because 9 times out of 10, you're outgunned thrice-fold. Shootout locations are almost always claustrophobic and cramped, but still designed with flanking and hiding in mind. Make no mistake, F.E.A.R isn't exactly a cover shooter. You still have to move around and get your hands dirty. It deviates itself from Blood by making our protagonist, the Point Man, much less of a high-velocity rocket like Caleb is. Point Man's crouch isn't something quick enough to get you out of someone's crosshairs, nor are any of his melee attacks worthwhile. Why would you ever consider using them if you can, shoot shotgun them? You know who's under that mask? It's Max Payne. That is to say, this game has a slow motion mode we can temporarily activate to give us an edge. Whether that edge is aggressive or defensive is entirely up to you. Do you want to spam it and slow mode shotgun everyone as quick as you can, or use it to try and eke out of a bad vantage point and reposition yourself? Both options have equal value, and because this slow-mo mode is a meter that must be refilled, it can be overtaxed and leave you in a really bad position if you overplay your hand. There was careful consideration applied to the balancing, so you aren't just spamming it as much as possible to win every shootout. You might assume that every scenario in the game can be solved by just activating slow mode when you can and headshotting everything in sight, but what makes F.E.A.R truly exceptional is that despite all these abilities, you're still the underdog. You're almost never fighting one-on-one. Enemies are just as capable of corner peeking as you are. They reposition themselves, flank you. These psychically controlled clone soldiers are some of the medium's most impressive NPCs for the mid-2000s. There's so many instances of me getting flanked out because I was too in the zone to notice all the callouts they made, which you can easily take advantage of. They hear your footsteps and gunfire, they can see your flashlight. Every combat scenario follows the same exchange of subterfuge and savagery that never tires because of how quick thinking and multifaceted the enemy AI is. Mostly. Look, the game is from 2005, so naturally it is outdated in some regards. You're going to notice some extremely glaring patterns, like how everyone ducks and stops firing when you throw a grenade, no matter the distance or direction. They are still very much exploitable, but comparing them to games from around the same time frame, these guys are still leagues above anything else. Just look at the places we're shooting at. Office buildings, parking lots, ferries. F.E.A.R's locations and set pieces are pedestrian, normal spots in any metropolitan city. The game's sci-fi, military, conspiracy theory story about secret experiments lends itself well to hosting these shootouts in tucked-away corners of nondescript cities to make the world feel alive. Bodies of working-class guys spruce up the warehouses you throw grenades in. Radios bark about unidentified shots fired around town are the only hints that anyone living in these areas is even faintly aware of what's going on. The world of F.E.A.R is a rich, red velvet layer cake of secretive delight. Concrete jungle is a term thrown around for these urban hellscapes decorated with fake plastic trees and light-polluted skylines, and F.E.A.R's implementation of the term is Amazonian. The atmosphere of each area is simply to die for. The world is hazy. The fluorescent hum of office lights are all it needs as a soundtrack to splatter clone soldier brain off the off-white walls. In the game's final hours, we get to explore more outwardly sci-fi laboratories with vaults and underground testing areas. You get a tremendous feel for sprawling around the underbellies of all these buildings. Any chance I got to gaze up at the night sky was one I took with glee. Despite not physically being there, the air still felt stale. That's a splendid example of immersion. You can really feel the Half-Life influence with all the vents you have to crawl around in. All those little employee-only areas inside each building are mandatory for progression. You get to see all the innards of each place you're in. It's wonderful. There's even a similarly really annoying flashlight that has an unnecessarily strict timer on it. Health and reflex vials are placed on tables and hidden around corners, and while it's really not the end of the world to miss a few health vials, get every reflex vial you can find. This game does have a pretty sharp difficulty curve that will make you a lot more reliant on using health kits. The limit being 10 sounds overly generous, but you're going to need as many as you can get your hands on, believe me. But what of the actual horror aspects? This game leans more into action than outright fear, despite the title, but the constant visions you get are suitably nightmarish enough to tease the brain. Buckets of blood, haunting apparitions, the few glimpses we get at Paxton Fettel, the guy controlling all these soldiers, are especially tense. He has a permanent bloody mouth because the game opens up with him eating a random guy, which I probably should have just led with. What I forgot, and subsequently remembered, then groaned about in my first recording playthrough, is that this game does try and have some quirky, funny moments for levity, which unfortunately came off as viscerally unfunny. There's this IT guy, Norton Mapes, who acts as both a minor antagonist and comic relief figure throughout his incredibly fat, harebrained antics, usually trying to get the point man killed for seemingly no reason other than the fact it amuses him. It's always really pace-breaking when he shows up. It's like when Looker shows up in Pokemon. You just have to roll your eyes and glaze over until he's done flapping his lips.
You disable the local security system, and I'll see what I can do about the server.
I can disable it remotely once I'm logged in.
No, you can't. It's on a separate network.
I found out later that there was a promotional Rooster Teeth video series commissioned by Monolith called Panics.
Well, then what do you guys do all the time?
We collect the easiest paycheck on Earth, that's what we do.
The Point Man does have teammates with some form of personalities, but nothing outside the immediate conjuration of me asking, create a personality for a character in a highly specialized military group in ChatGPT. You know the drill. Spencer Jankowitzki is your sardonic dickhead coworker who I think gets eaten by Paxton early on. Jin Sung Kwang's a woman. Harland Wade is a semi-retired science guy with sketchy projects he keeps under wraps. No one detracts much from the experience, but they aren't exactly thought-provoking either, except for Paxton. He is a complete cartoon character with a very Sephiroth, Genova type relationship with Alma, and I mean that exactly in the way you're thinking of. Peter Lorre's deliciously hammy but genuinely threatening vocal performance helps turn Fettel into someone who's both a joy and a fright to listen to. I am proud to say that his voice is a constant throughout not only this game, but the franchise.
What's the first name you remember? The dead man's name was Charles Haberger. I remember him. But are the memories mine or hers?
The story of F.E.A.R. does fall into the trap of Focus M. You're constantly receiving orders and updates from other soldiers or the boys in whatever HQ you're positioned in beat by beat. But at the very least, it rarely forces you to stay put in one location like Half-Life 2. You're free to move on and ignore everything and shoot until the game's over. I will say that all the info you're drip-fed is certainly interesting. Tons of talks about the military abducting and grooming kids, studies into people's psychic potential. Project Origins at the center of all this, which involves Harlan's daughter, Alma. I don't want to fully spoil the ending revelation, but it was something that took me by surprise. It's shockingly dark, but still felt like a natural, logical endpoint to the game's building question of, from beginning to end, F.E.A.R. is firing on all cylinders, so it's easy to see why it's oft regarded as a classic amongst shooter and horror games, making it one of the crowning titles of the titular hybrid genre, but it isn't without its flaws. I really wish you didn't walk this slow all the time, for starters. Could we get some pep in our step, Point Man? I know the melee option was programmed in case you somehow ran out of available ammo and grenades, but my goodness, you have to put yourself in such a bad position in order to use it. You're basically asking for one of the office building's janitors to pick your bones out of the carpet. Maybe that was the point, to trick you into forcing a reload without pausing the game. Now, I've mentioned grenades, but there's also an assortment of other throwable objects that really just don't prove to be useful very consistently. The mines are pretty good for these Juggernaut guys, but the remote control bombs really don't help much since the enemy soldier's AI will often react to you attempting to strategically plant these bombs by avoiding them completely. The game's reputation precedes it, not for nothing, but I feel like people need to calm down at least a little bit. It is a fantastic game, one of my favorites, but come on now. The game's from 2005, we can stop touting it as the best example of enemy AI in all of gaming. Okay? Okay. It also doesn't help that nearly every combat encounter is just a varying array of the same soldiers with the same weapons. Once or twice you get something trickier, but once the final new threat is introduced around halfway, the game gets exceptionally comfortable with not trying to ramp up anymore. It falls very easily into a routine, but it's one hell of a routine. F.E.A.R. was met with near universal love and praise in nearly every department, winning a ton of awards for basically every category a video game could have and instantly cementing itself as a classic. The 2000s was still the era of standalone DLC expansion packs, and F.E.A.R. got two, both created by Timegate Studios. Extraction Point picks up right after the ending of the first games and serves as a mini-campaign, and Perseus Mandate is a side story featuring new characters investigating something else and getting roped up into the Alma Paxton situation. Both of these aren't nearly as strong as the original release because Timegate Studios only managed to do an okay job with handling enemy placement and map design, but their inexperience is really pronounced in Perseus Mandate because all the new enemies they programmed are infuriating to deal with. And I don't recall either of these two expansions running very stably when I played them years ago. They come with the modern PC release with F.E.A.R, or you can buy the F.E.A.R files on 360 that compiles them together on a single disc. F.E.A.R files is oddly pricey on the secondhand market, so unless you're obsessed with the first game, I honestly don't recommend you play these. Not only are they subpar by F.E.A.R standards, they're also non-canon, because Warner Bros. Was very aware of the success of this game and did what they did best: try and extract blood from a stone by turning F.E.A.R into a franchise. F.E.A.R 2 Project Origin is one of those maligned sequels that people simply can't decide if it's a good game or not. You ask 10 different people how they feel about it, you're gonna get 10 different answers. The fact it even exists is a miracle, because its development story is absolutely outrageous. Originally, Monolith literally could not use the acronym F.E.A.R in the title because Vivendi, who held the rights for it before Warner Bros., long story, wouldn't give them up. So for a while the project was just called Project Origin, among other potential candidate names like Afraid or Chuck Norris, because of a 2007 contest to submit names for the game. Monolith also wasn't satisfied with how the console ports of F.E.A.R turned out under Day One Studios, so they handled that in-house by attempting to make the console versions tailored to each piece of hardware to increase performance and utilize what the PS3 and Xbox 360 were capable of, until they realized that was a dumb idea and made them as close as possible. After seeing the PS3 trying to run F.E.A.R, I'm not sure if I blame them. Announcement of a sequel came in February of 2006, just a couple months after the release of the first game, but Monolith at least seemed a little more gung-ho to hurriedly create a sequel this time around. Warner Bros. Was kind enough to give them around 2 years or so to make a finished product, which is perhaps their only good trait as a company, that they're willing to wait more than 2 years for a game to be finished. Vivendi was trying to make their own F.E.A.R 2 at this time, but since Warner Bros. Had already started production on theirs, they had to quickly retool whatever they had cobbled up into another game. But I'd really rather not talk about it. February of 2009 saw the release of F.E.A.R 2 Project Origin on PC and home consoles, and for once, the PC port of this game is actually quite good, at least from what I remember when I played it years ago, but I'm sticking with my 360 copy for consistency's sake. F.E.A.R 2 is a sequel taking place immediately after the events of the first game in a separate timeline, which really threw me for a loop. Project Origin is the most prequel-sounding subtitle I have ever seen in my entire life. I know it's referring to a plot point from the first game, but this game introduces another project called Harbinger? I don't know. So instead of naming it F.E.A.R 2 Project Harbinger to make it abundantly clear this is a sequel, they chose Project Origin and confused the hell out of everyone. Whatever. Right off the bat, F.E.A.R 2's presentation is head and shoulders above the first game's. The OG F.E.A.R already looked impressive for the mid-2000s, but F.E.A.R 2 sits among the year's most impressive releases like Modern Warfare 2 and Batman Arkham Asylum. The textures are richly detailed, the lighting is deep and ambient. It's able to make both brightly lit offices and pitch-black basements feel immersive and threatening. I remember F.E.A.R 2 looking a lot more colorful than the original, and my memories have not betrayed me. Office walls and linoleum floors feel vibrant and natural because of their appropriately washed out color palettes. I suspect deep introspection went into the attention to detail for work environment layouts to make every area feel convincing and legitimate, so when the buckets of blood douse everything, the familiarity and reliability I have for places that look exactly like this heightens the tension that comes with the violence that surveys them. The texture warping and the screen tearing that comes with the game's frequent hallucinations is frightening. The tearing really sells the visual of reality melting before your character's eyes. Lith tech was seriously upgraded and augmented to a noticeable, welcome degree. The performance on console is rock solid, the 360 handles everything no problem, and I've heard that the PS3 version is comparably adequate, which is no small feat considering how much of a nightmare that console is to work with. Polished is the best possible word I can describe the entire game with. Absolutely everything has been polished to soften any rough edges to try and improve on what came before. But not all this polishing was needed. In fact, a lot of it did more harm than good, and this is seen most immediately, in my opinion, through the shift in art direction. F.E.A.R 2 looks great, one of the best looking Xbox 360 games, but putting it side by side with the original shows just how divorced it is from the original art direction. F.E.A.R 1 was about 2/3 in reality, with the last third being science fiction. The Point Man looked like a semi-realistic Black Ops guy. Most of the guns were modeled after real guns. The buildings you snaked through looked like ordinary places you'd see in America. Even when you obtained wackier guns and found underground laboratories, there was an effort to make the environments and weaponry look kind of feasible. Kind of. F.E.A.R 2 throws most of this out the window and adds so many glowing blue and orange bits to your guns you'd think this private military corporation was being sponsored by Nerf. Why does my shotgun need an orange tip? Everything has that really cheesy sci-fi look that weakens the conspiratorial angle the first game had going for it, which is weird because it takes place like a couple days after F.E.A.R 1. So Point Man had mostly regular guns on him, but these new characters all look like they came from a Hollywood movie. Every office building has some generic tech overlay that pulses and glows and takes away that sterile familiarity I just praised. All the underground science labs feel way too clean. The art direction lacks the edge found in the first game that reinforced these locations as secret areas hastily constructed by amoral scientists. I don't believe Alma Wade was being kept here against her will. This place looks like Gru from Despicable Me built it. The more inventive the game tries to get with its visuals, the more flavorless they look. They have boring mech suits. How do you have boring mech suits? There's no better example of this shift in mindset than the UI. It's an in-universe HUD displayed by our main character's techie sunglasses instead of something just for the player. Big plastic sunglasses, orange-tipped guns. I could go outside with my gel-fire Nerf gun, put on the safety goggles, and move in slow motion to play F.E.A.R 2 in real life. Most of the environments are either uninspired or straight up copy-pasted from the first game to lesser effect, but there are some new locations that I happen to like. Around half of this game takes place in the main city that got nuked at the end of the last game, don't worry about the context, with broken bits of concrete strewn about crumbled streets and abandoned buildings desperately holding on to life. It's definitely cliché and looks more like Bridgeport, Connecticut than Hiroshima, but I appreciate the attempt, even if I'm not fully convinced this place was destroyed by a nuclear bomb. Far and away the best location in the game is Wade Elementary, a school set up by Harlan Wade as a front to illegally experiment on children with psychic projects. I'm a sucker for abandoned schools as a location, and remarkably, the amount of detail that went into not only replicating the interior of an elementary school, but a school that's a front for an illegal science experiment is exceptional. Sketchy hallways, children's drawing on notebooks and blackboards, notes on the curriculum and seating plans. The lore and diligence that went into making this place feel real places it alongside Silent Hill's Midwich Elementary as the apex of schools as a location in horror games, and I don't say that lightly. Another victim of the aggressive polishing campaign that constitutes F.E.A.R 2's game design is found most glaringly in its combat. The lean buttons have been entirely removed, replaced with what exactly? Nothing. Nothing replaced them. You have to face every foe head-on now. Instead of carefully strategizing against a group and poking your head out when required and picking off the most dangerous targets, there's no reason to not just brazenly charge into every combat encounter guns blazing and shoot them before they shoot you, which gets stale well past the first hour of adventure and never deviates in any meaningful way. Ironically, despite F.E.A.R 1 having lean buttons specifically designed to shoot behind corners, F.E.A.R 2 feels more like a cover shooter because there's no rhythm between taking cover and shooting. The middle ground has been torn up for a black and white, all or nothing philosophy. You're either hiding or shooting, not both. Not even the little bits of foliage you can flip over to make cover alleviate that. To its limited credit, it does make each place you shoot up feel like a real location. But this mechanic immediately plummets when you realize that there's no good reason to ever hide and not shoot someone for longer than 2 seconds, unless you're reloading. It takes on a very Call of Duty approach, where all you're primarily intended to do is aim for a headshot as soon as possible and then move on, which is in no way more interesting than what the series had prior. So I'm baffled that Monolith's efforts were put into simplifying combat rather than expanding it. All my combat recordings for this game look exactly the same. I point and shoot wherever I please as the enemy soldiers run towards me like lambs to the slaughter, taking 2-second breaks to reload then running back out, barely paying attention, somehow not getting shot at once. Slow-mo is back from the first game, but you can make a compelling argument for this actually being time stop rather than slowing because you move much faster than everyone else during slow-mo to a completely unreasonable degree. You can actively change weapons, reload, do basically whatever you please within slow-mo, which completely snaps this game in two. What is the challenge present in seeing 3 enemies rapidly approach, activating slow-mo, then headshotting all of them with my sniper rifle, with meter to spare? This makes the already simplified combat tedious and even more repetitive than the first games, and there's even less enemy variety here. Health packs and armor originally given to you in ridiculous quantities because you can lose your life in seconds if you aren't careful, but F.E.A.R 2 shackles you with a health kit limit of 3, and armor is far sparser to try and balance the overall lower difficulty, which erases any unique qualities such a basic mechanic had in exchange for something far plainer. Beyond a shadow of doubt, this totally annihilates the tactical shooting aspects of the franchise and replaces it with something incredibly bog standard, unimaginative, and plain. But that doesn't mean it isn't without its upsides. F.E.A.R 2's weapons are incredibly responsive, and not only do they all feel good to shoot, all of them have uses. There's less emphasis on frequent swapping due to a smaller weapon count, and an increase of 4 from the first game's limit of 3 weapons on your person at any given time, and many weapons have adjustable firing rates depending on your preference. This means that your standard assault rifle can be burst fire whenever you feel like saving ammunition and playing a little bit more cautiously. It's a very effective and fun evolution from the first game's clumsy swapping system. The rarer special weapons, like sniper rifles and rocket launchers, feel much smoother to use, even if they're totally overkill. Grenades are far more useful this time around too, especially the shock ones. The enemy AI has also been tweaked to be much more mobile, which I feel is a welcome change. I don't quite think they're as smart as beforehand. They don't use clever formations or flank you nearly as much, but they make good usage of the environment to hide and quickly mobilize until they're point-blank distance with you. I will say these guys are obnoxiously silent. I was getting jump scared by turning corners all the time because they make no noise until they step to the side and blast you. The verbal callouts of the original complemented the more stop-and-go combat, so I guess removing them in favor of more twitch-based, reaction-heavy shooting makes some sense, even if I don't prefer it. Some minor quality of life features were added, like the flashlight being indefinite, and we have actual sprinting now. It only lasts 2 seconds, but I'm glad I at least have some way to quickly run somewhere. F.E.A.R 2 does have a story, but man, they messed up badly. Catastrophically even. Like I've mentioned, this is a direct sequel taking place like 5 seconds after the first game. You actually witness the nuke at the very start. You play as a new character, Delta Force Sergeant Michael Beckett, who is also a silent protagonist. He has his own crew that follows him for the duration of the game, and they do not shut up for even a single second.
Man, I could really go for an extra hot, no-whip, white chocolate macchiato.
Somebody sure bled out fast.
Red, where are you?
Still climbing.
There's this new character, Snake Fist, a whistleblower type who's helping you throughout the game, who makes me wish I had Norton Mapes back.
But what are you still doing in that facility? They're about to blow the whole place to hell.
By the way, don't pick your nose. She's watching us on the security cameras. She can't hear us, so you can call her whatever you want.
You're like free pizza at an anime convention. She can smell you, and she wants to consume you.
Nothing he says landed for me. It's just cringe. I'm clearly indifferent to the humor here, and I'm sure plenty of people found this funny, but this kind of Joss Whedon-style quipping being inserted into a game about conspiracy cover-ups and cloned soldiers being birthed underground feels reckless at best. Tonally, this game is a disaster. It tries to be tense and atmospheric in its environments and combat, but completely overdoses from a serious overprescription to bathos. Alma was impregnated as a teenager to birth Paxton Fiddle? Like, that just happened? She's right behind me, isn't she? The campaign is almost as long as the original game, but the entire story can be summarized as: you're sent in to investigate the fallout of the first game's ending. Alma is still alive and actively pursuing you. Everything that happens in between is either narrative padding, like having one of your bum soldiers piss off to Waterloo, or getting more background information on the various science experiments for the sake of lore. Alma Wade's project origin in the game's new project, Harbinger, which involves trying to manipulate people's genetic makeup to turn them into psychic commanders in a way that doesn't take 30 years and result in Paxton Fettel, takes the lion's share of interest in this game. Speaking of Paxton, it turns out I lied when I said he was in the whole franchise. He actually isn't in this game at all. So one of the only 2 real characters in this franchise was KIA. Great. I have no doubt in my mind that a lot of people probably love to comb over dozens of lore documents, but to me, this kills the ambiguity and mystique of Project Origin. It already did a lot of the narrative heavy lifting without needing a codex option in the menu. I was more than okay with the few plot points we got in F.E.A.R 1, it still felt dark and impactful. But what about Alma? You might want to sit down for this one. So Alma's running loose, causing all kinds of havoc, and because Michael Beckett and other members of his squad are unknowingly part of Harbinger, which was meant to groom them to be psychic commanders, Alma is very attracted to Bennett. And I mean attracted in the most literal way possible.
I'm a horny Michael.
I am being fully serious when I say the entire premise of this game is that Alma Wade, who now projects a sexy form, is actively lusting over Beckett the whole way through, and this is what's being treated as the main vehicle for the game's scares. I want to ask the audience a question. Imagine a ghostly woman who looks exactly like Sadako from The Ring, completely naked by the way, is extraordinarily horny and wants to become your pregnant and barefoot wife and will kill anyone to get to you. I am incredibly confident that most people will run towards her. You know that line about the pizza I showed you earlier? That was meant as a metaphor to describe her carnal desire for you. There's a full scene of Alma riding you and moaning in your ear. This is unbelievable! I really can't understate how perplexing of a choice this was. To make this plot point attempt to seem scary, there's no psychosexual analysis beyond Alma acting like an animal. This feels like being chased by a yandere in a cheap indie game meant for manly badass hero to play. How anyone on the dev team thought people would be scared by this and not excited is a question for the beaters. World beaters, that is. Aside from being a nuclear bomb that completely destroys any attempt this game could ever have at being scary, it also leads to one of the most surprising endings in any video game. Not a good ending, but a surprising one, I'll say. I don't think this is a case where something was considered scary once upon a time, simply aging poorly. People were scare-roused, as some have coined it. You get jump scared a dozen times by Alma essentially trying to kiss you. Come on! Beckett being another silent protagonist is partly a good thing, mostly so I don't have to hear more cringe dialogue, but also falls pretty flat because he does a much poorer job of starting out as an everyman. The Point Man didn't even have a face. He could literally be anybody until further plot beats detailed his character more. His little arc was a much gentler and more compelling ride. Beckett starts out as a somebody, but it's hard to empathize with Alma stalking him because he has no verbal or strong physical reaction to anything at all. The game wants to have its cake and eat it too because Beckett has established relationships and a backstory that matters right off the bat, but he's also meant to be projected onto. The issue isn't that I think people can't project onto a protagonist with an established past. Plenty of games prove that. No, I'm not even gonna give an explanation. The only time people project onto Michael is when he bangs Alma. This is not a real character. It gets even dumber when he shows up in F.E.A.R, but don't make me talk about that game. I can almost taste the stale air in the boardrooms where a bunch of Warner Bros. Producers demanded turrets and mech suit sections solely because they wanted to emulate other shooters at the time, and that's what put the final nail in this game's coffin. It tried to refine and polish what came before, but what ended up happening was it left behind everything that made it unique to fit into the crowd. F.E.A.R 2 is an artist that abandoned everything that made him stand out in order to appeal to the broadest demographic possible. I can't even say it's more the same, because it lost a ton of what made the first game good. While the core bread and butter shooting works completely fine, almost everything new it brings to the table is a serious downgrade that hurts the game rather than helps it. It's a casual drive through a safe neighborhood. There's no adventure, no danger, or excitement, except for almost assaulting you, I guess. But sometimes, all you want is a relaxing cruise. And it does that well. It runs smoothly, the shooting is fine, it's entirely playable, but not much else. This is a dirt cheap game, so I can certainly recommend this to any FPS nut looking for a good 2-3 days to blow on something mindless, but tolerable. But for fans of the previous game, I find it hard to imagine that people would like this more, or even as much as the first. It's just fine as a game. But it's completely smothered under the shadow of its elder brother, much like Paxton is under his. And speaking of, there is a small piece of DLC for this game called Reborn, but it isn't worth playing at all. It's barely an hour long, and it's mostly just an excuse to resurrect Paxton for a future installment. And that future installment was F.E.A.R. I'm not calling it F.E.A.R 3, it's F.E.A.R. Point Man looks like he lives on a Royal Caribbean cruise ship, and Paxton still has Earl's rib sauce all over his face. This game is shit for the birds. Warner Bros. Wasn't content with farting out F.E.A.R. and tried to make a multiplayer, free-to-play game called F.E.A.R. Online, developed by a Korean company called In-Play Interactive, who also made the online multiplayer for F.E.A.R. 2 and for F.E.A.R. that I didn't mention because, in case you weren't aware, it's kind of a challenging task to find people who want to play a multiplayer game from 2009 to 2011 respectively. It's like trying to find a pair-up buddy to get adult circumcision together. Would it shock you to find out that F.E.A.R. Online lasted less than a year and completely destroyed the F.E.A.R. franchise? It shouldn't, because that's exactly what happened. Just as quickly as it burst onto the scene, F.E.A.R. died in its sleep, and now it lingers like a ghost over the gaming landscape, occasionally possessing the rogue video creator to remind everyone how good it once was, myself included. Monolith had no involvement in F.E.A.R. or Online. That was all Warner Bros. And their various contracted studios, which left Monolith ample time to develop other Warner Bros. Properties they were foisted with, like Gotham City Imposters. I've heard people swear by this game back in the day, but I think we all know which games Monolith were mostly known for in the 2010s. It was the Middle-earth series. Warner Bros.' status as a brand name aggregator finally meant something because they commissioned Monolith to make a duology of incredibly intricate open-world adventure games set in the Lord of the Rings Middle-earth that took the industry by storm. These are big-budget, massive adventure games that showcased all of what Monolith had learned about enemy AI and programming through the Nemesis system, which gave foes unique names and playstyles that the player would have to figure out in order to beat. 2014 saw the release of Shadow of Mordor, and 2017 begot a sequel, Shadow of War. Warner Bros. Decided to reward Monolith by putting them in charge of a DC property once again through developing an ambitious but poorly documented Wonder Woman game, which was first announced in 2021, after Monolith tried to make an original IP for 4 years that was cancelled by Warner Bros., who thought it was smelly and had a better idea, so subtract 4 years worth of wages. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention, Warner Bros. Was steadily going bankrupt for years. Game after game was hit with poor sales or massive media controversies that continually kneecapped the company, so much so they had to make drastic cuts and focus on very few select franchises to keep making games for, and Monolith, with all of its assets, right in the middle of developing the Wonder Woman game, was one of the first companies to be gutted. You heard me right. Warner Bros. Let Monolith develop a game for almost half a decade after canceling one they were already making for 4 years, then said GG and shut down the studio. That's how Monolith died. Abruptly. I remember that moment so vividly because I was there. 1 year and 3 or 4 months ago, depending on when this video was finished, I saw the studio behind some of my favorite games of all time suddenly slain by a corporation that decided to redirect all funds into Hogwarts Legacy, their only profitable venture in almost a decade. The industry chewed them up and spat them out, but their legacy will never be forgotten. F.E.A.R. and Condemned live on in spiritual successors like Team 17's Trepang 2 and David Zemansky's Butcher's Creek, but the original games can never be replaced. Blood is a property that's still around because of Atari or something, but the vast majority of their games are not available to purchase anywhere digitally because the licenses expired or copyright is still being sorted out. Condemned was taken off of Steam in 2025. No One Lives Forever, as a franchise, is nowhere to be seen. I don't know if Night Dive needs to resurrect their library or not, but I can't let this company and its games go unsung in praise and significance because they deserve to be remembered, even if some of them are kinda ass. Pour one out, bud.
Body to its resting place.
Peeps? It's a f***ing nickname. Family name is Piparelli. They're gonna redo it. JC.
People will argue back and forth about if Doom is a proper horror game series or not, but Doom 3 is unanimously agreed upon as horror for reasons I hope are obvious. The year 2000 was a critically important transitional year for id Software, a giant of the industry. John Romero had long left the company and took most of its swag with him, leaving the wickedly talented and studious John Carmack as the captain that steered the company in a stable direction after the release of Quake in the form of 2 sequels, which refined and expanded upon the respective Quake engine each time. The furious arms race that various game developers engaged in consistently demanded better graphical quality and higher fidelity, and it was clear in the year 2000 that the Quake engine in its current state would no longer be able to compete with the likes of Deus Ex and System Shock 2. So Carmack did what he did best. Crunch like no tomorrow, slaving away on a brand new engine to use in a handful of games before tossing it out and repeating the cycle all over again. id Tech 4, or the Doom 3 engine, positively stunned audiences when it was showcased in 2002, by Steve Jobs, might I add. And it was clear that the decision to revive the then slumbering Doom franchise with a big fancy pants reboot was gonna blow everyone's socks off. Take a hike, Romero. The other John's about to do his namesake and treat the industry like a one-night stand. But there is one teeny tiny, small, insignificant problem. No one at id actually knew what Doom 3 was supposed to be. Everything I read about Doom 3's development cycle made the offices of id sound like an oubliette. People pulled weeks of crunch. Deadlines were sudden and put everyone in the building in constant panic. There was hardly a unified vision on what the end product needed to be. Employees were described as split down the middle. Some wanted the traditional fast-paced and strategic mania of the two classic entries, while some wanted to adopt the ambience and careful deliberation in combat and exploration that marked more contemplative, immersive games. These two styles could not be more different. This clashing of heads would permeate the very DNA of Doom 3 and cause its reception to be fundamentally mixed to this day. I wish I had reserved my "no one knows how to rank this game" spiel for Doom 3 instead of F.E.A.R 2, because I have never seen the same set of opinions twice about this game. Everyone has their own reasons for liking it or disliking it, and I suspect the things that I liked and disliked about it will elicit the opposite reaction from some viewers. Let's take a look at why people remain so split down the middle about this problem child entry, because it's been a minute since I've played this one. I'm rocking the original Steam release and not BFG for reasons you'll see later. Thankfully, playing this game on a modern computer is a breeze. It runs super smoothly, and you can force it into widescreen by changing a few numbers in the config files. This is such a breath of fresh air compared to all other games with horrific PC ports I've been forced to use. Now, why is Doom 3 considered a horror game? Easy. It's slow and you can't see anything. Okay, there's more to it than that, but certainly not wrong. The original Doom games were built around quickly dashing around various maps to weave between enemy fire and collect keys to access some additional areas, while Doom 3 had one big interconnected map you travel through with distinct loading zones, and to compensate for the vastly increased breadth of the map, your movement speed is much slower. This is not what I would call a slow game by any margin. You move and sprint at a very acceptable speed that's entirely typical, but it certainly isn't anywhere near the top speeds of OG Doom guy. The Mars space station is far from sprawling. Its claustrophobic corridors are staunchly linear and provide little in the way of detours or hidden routes, if any. I know this is a contested aspect of the game, but this style of one big map instead of 20 odd-something levels stapled together to give the illusion of interconnectedness was fairly new for shooters because the typically massive load times such a structure would demand were frustrating and took you out of the experience. Since Doom 3 was such an expensive technical showcase designed by a genius go-getter, these loading times were incredibly fair for 2004. The map has dedicated loading zones in the form of elevators or sealed entryways to make them feel diegetic and natural. For as technically impressive as it is, I feel that all the hallways do become somewhat labyrinthian, not in layout, but in visuals. Hardly any of these locations stand out. They're all the same tasteless flavor of sheet metal gray hallways or yellow accented industrial strongholds with a littered sprawl of broken computers that makes it difficult to landmark or get myself properly immersed. From the moment you boot up the game, everything is going to look like some minor variation of the intro landing bay. Where's all the color? It's all so gray and drab and lifeless. Hell is only seen towards the last couple hours of the game, but predictably, it's easily where the game shines the most visually. There's a terrific blend of medieval dungeon stonemasonry, fire and brimstone, and inky black voids of space around you. It sold me on this place being a dark realm of anguish and torture immediately. Arguably the best depiction of hell in the entire franchise. Doom 3 goes for a far more cinematic approach than its sister games, featuring numerous cutscenes with a slight increase in narrative to really showcase how far it had come. Spaceships docking, character expressions, there's a lot of mobile camera work here that shows off the detail and splendor of id Tech 4. Though I'm not alone in saying that being shown constant third-person cutscenes in a Doom game feels kind of unnecessary to flex a narrative that, while more detailed, wasn't designed to take up much real estate in your mind. I will say these cutscenes work a lot better than Doom Eternal's cutscenes. At least these establish a mood. Doom 3 Doom guy is still very much a silent protagonist, so the cutscenes in this game kind of feel like they're from Subspace Emissary. They can be skipped, thankfully. You should remember this for later. For 2004, people were blown away, and not for no reason. The texture work here is simply excellent. The wall paneling, character models, your guns. This game was considered a marvel of its time that forced people to upgrade their machines just to play. And the most famous aspect of the tireless fidelity that put this game on the map is its lighting. Doom 3 arguably has the most famous flashlight in all of video games, because an integral part of id Tech 4 was its decadent shadows, which allowed id to set a mood in obscure parts of the environment with a level of detail and immersiveness that was never quite seen before it. It's not like other games didn't have darkness and flashlight mechanics, but lighting was always one of the pricklier parts of early 3D gaming. So Doom 3 bursting out the gate with such an overt shadow system that didn't affect the performance was astonishing. It was spotlighted in basically every review of the game, professional and casual alike. However, maybe it's because I didn't play this at launch or just missed the era of hype for it, but Doom 3 really does not feel like it's in the same conversation as other graphical titans of 2004. Don't get me wrong, this game looked far better than most games did upon release. But compared to Half-Life 2? Compared to Far Cry? I'm sorry, this looks closer to the original Time Splitters than it does Far Cry, or even Myst 4. There's a jarring blockiness that tattles the fact that this game was in development hell before this Doom guy ever stepped foot in actual hell. One could reductively call it an upgraded PS2 game by comparison. The Mars base being in disrepair obviously necessitates the use of your flashlight to tell where you're going with the F key, which illuminates the game's most controversial feature, the combat. You can't use the flashlight with any of your guns. You must manually switch between them at a moment's notice in order to survive. This mandatory legwork completely annihilates Doom 3 for a lot of people, turning a franchise that had such high-octane action into a sluggish corridor simulator that takes forever because engaging in combat with the most basic enemies demands you flip-flop between being able to see and shoot. This is the game's most iconic, or infamous, aspect, and I feel very strongly about it, because I dub it this game's master stroke. The swap between flashlight and firearm is almost immediate. I find you're rarely ever caught with your pants down upon seeing something. There's always some time to react. This means that every dark room isn't just for atmosphere, however thorough it is. It possesses a very valid possibility of a demon hiding inside that has its eyes locked on you, and you don't even know it. Sometimes there really is nothing there, but sometimes you need cat-like reflexes in order to respond to something very present and very angry. Those few microseconds of trying to figure out if something is there is the true horror calling that Doom 3 thrives on. It has me operating on such a consistent level of paranoia that there isn't a single moment where I'm not on edge and anticipating that something is lurking around the corner waiting to leap out at me with its sharp claws. This is one of the purest representations of raw, unfettered survival horror I've ever seen. All the game needs is an inventory system. Having to swap out your flashlight also means that when you can shoot, you must rely on instincts and spatial awareness in order to make out where something is before it burps in your face. You always feel like you're the underdog in every combat scenario, which is an absolutely stunning move for keeping such a long campaign interesting while maintaining paranoia and fear. The flashlight bobs up and down as you walk, never acting as a typically unbothered beam of light. It's such a creative mechanic that made me change my perception on the flashlight mechanic, something I normally take for granted in games. People who are critical of this mechanic say it makes combat repetitive and doesn't always prepare you adequately for specific threats. Some foes are considerably faster than you and have a much easier time blindsiding the player, and I agree. This combat system is not perfect. I've died many times because I wasn't able to react fast enough to something I probably could have avoided if a flashlight functioned like it did in every other game. But this mechanic is so instrumental for Doom 3's tone and atmosphere that the removal of this would mean that the dynamic lighting system would almost be pointless, and the whole game would backslide into a more generic shooter game that betrays all the efforts that was put into standing out as a technological and gameplay experience. If I had to suggest a quick fix, why not indicate you're staring at something with a color change on the crosshair like Serious Sam does? The crosshair flashes red when you shoot something, but why not make it green when you're aiming at it? If you really hate the guesswork that much, I could see that as a toggleable option being a happy compromise that does something for the critics and a completely optional, non-intrusive mechanic to keep the purists happy. Believe me, the flashlight mechanic is not what I believe to be this game's biggest, most damning sin, because there's something else that's far more troublesome that completely wrecks so much of the experience for me: the difficulty. Or rather, how it clashes with enemy formation and behavior. That might seem like an odd complaint. Doom has never been a walk in the park, and I consider myself pretty good at FPS games as a whole, but Doom 3's idea of difficulty is so unfathomably volatile that when I booted this game up for the first time in years, I had a flashback rather than a wave of nostalgia overtake me. Take a look at the last proper save I made on my Steam account. I like when enemies hide in the darkness and wait to attack you. But you know what I don't like? When they spawn directly in your face or behind you. Unless you've played this game, you will not believe the amount of times something will just pop into existence in front of you and one-shot you in the span of 2 seconds. What if I told you that a disturbingly disproportionate amount of the enemies in this game use hit-scan weapons, as in you cannot dodge their bullets? Yes, you will lose half of your health to a gray soldier all the way across the room that was totally silent. Most of the time you won't even get to see them before you die. Usually you'll be surrounded by 2 or 3 of these hit-scan enemies at once, and Doomguy is certainly no Caleb. There's just no time to react and kill everything before you inevitably take damage or just straight up die. My footage disproportionately consists of me entering a room and running right back out when I see there's half a dozen guys pointing rifles at me that I physically am unable to deal with. Enemies will pop out of the walls or the thin air and instantly fold me like laundry on this difficulty mode, often swarming me and hiding underneath the questionable FOV to essentially go undetected, though that's probably my fault since I forced widescreen. Need I remind you, basically every combat encounter is inside a cramped hallway. There's basically no opportunity to try and evade something that attempting to do so often results in reloading a save. But remember to quick save constantly, by the way. This was before the era of checkpoints every 5 minutes, so you have to make your own, which I actually prefer. I'm pretty used to that system on account of growing up with older games in the genre. Quick saving is instinctual at this point. On Veteran and Nightmare difficulties, this means that the only real playstyle I had with most of my weapons is hit and run. Fire a few shots, then turn the corner, and hope they didn't decide to barrel down the same hallway at that exact second. It's basically impossible to have an aggressive playstyle because a ludicrous amount of the garbage you have to face in this game is hit scan, and it's really difficult to weave through projectiles on account of being stuck with light jog and bouncing against the walls of a hallway. I feel you're just not equipped to deal with it. And for some godforsaken reason, armor in this game provides 20% damage reduction. To put it into perspective how utterly worthless that is, I'm frequently on single-digit health with almost maxed out armor throughout my entire recording. It might as well just be there for show. Most of this footage has me playing on Veteran difficulty with automatic reloading turned off. Try playing the game like that and tell me you aren't terrified the whole way through, because you'd be lying if you said you weren't. What makes me feel teeth-grinding frustration is how flimsy most of Doomguy's weapons feel. The fists and pistol are so pitifully weak they're not even worth using as a joke. The shotgun deals okay damage, but has an inconsistent bullet spread and takes so long to fire between shots you can set up a tent in between them. But the standard rifle is actually quite good at dealing damage quickly, especially from a distance. There are more interesting weapons to obtain later on through standard progression or exploration, but you're going to be rocking these ones for most of the adventure, and this is not a quick game. The campaign is around 10 hours, which is a very respectable length, but I'm shocked I didn't remember how agonizing it felt to play an entire adventure where the guns feel like they fire foam bullets. My issue isn't that the game is simply too hard, it's that what it does to employ difficulty does not connect with me whatsoever. I think it's questionable game design that trips over its own feet and makes the overall experience really not mesh with me. I'm capable of playing the game until the end, but getting there takes a lot out of me. There's always some cheap trick or underhanded nonsense going on that's going to snatch my life away and make me want to punch a desk. You shouldn't feel a shred of guilt when you look up all those passwords for those little ammo deposits throughout the map. Those audio logs throughout the game that contain them are really dry, and quite frankly, this game did not earn enough of my patience to make me sit through them. I should probably talk about those. System Shock was especially influential for Doom 3 because you have a whole HUD system that contains dossiers about you, your current objectives, and information about each location and the characters who reside there, with dozens of video and audio logs dotted around these areas acting as mandatory means for progression for opening doors. I know Doom 3 is a deliberately slower paced game, and I don't mind that, but as far as having to listen to audio logs go, this is no System Shock. These are just boring. I don't feel the lore to be found is anywhere near interesting enough to justify letting someone read off an employee's safety manual just to find the code for a safe to get 12 shells to my shotgun.
This is the audio log of maintenance technician Adam Bernache, dated November 10th, 2145. I fixed the couplings on the heat shields this morning with no problems. I did, however, have another odd experience while I was down there.
I really do sincerely admire the effort that was put into this game and how it wears its inspirations on its sleeve, but a single word keeps popping up in my head when I play this game and write about it. Misguided. Doom 3 feels fundamentally misguided in approach and execution. It has a serious identity crisis because it wants to be a thrilling adventure that demands your attention and patience, but it also still wants to keep the full-throttle firefights the original game pioneered. This attempt to try and accomplish both aspects left them not feeling right. It's tragically uncommitted. If I had to choose a side, I'd prefer if this game tried to go full immersive sim. My revisitation on this game has severely complicated my feelings on it, and feelings of complication is the only consistent sentiment that people agree on. Everyone feels differently about it, which I interpret as an expression of its commitment issues rather than its mastery in any field. The hype for a new Doom game carried it to being id's most profitable game at the time, with overwhelmingly positive review scores, but the division amongst exactly what people considered good about it was immediately apparent. The critical reception was a little schizophrenic. It made id boatfuls of cash, so work on an expansion pack was quickly underway, giving us Resurrection of Evil in 2005 by assistant studio Nerve Software, which added a bunch of new levels and some weapons like the iconic Super Shotgun and a royalty-free gravity gun. id, which was acquired by ZeniMax Media in 2009, was given a chance to iron out their problem child release's many kinks with the opportunity of a 2012 remaster called BFG Edition, which is technically the only way you can purchase Doom 3 digitally. The OG version is a free add-on with BFG, which is a very charitable move compared to how most companies treat their OG versions. Doom 3 BFG Edition dares to ask, what if Doom 3, but worse? Oh yeah, this is a remaster that detracts from the original game so profoundly that it feels like the jokers at Aspire were behind it. It did do some things better, like giving the game a much-deserved graphical overhaul that lets the environments really pop, but don't you see the problem? If you want me to spell it out for you, you can see. BFG cakes every environment with additional lighting that completely shreds the atmosphere into pieces. And even worse, your flashlight does not require to be swapped out. It now functions like how every other video game flashlight works. This very simple change destroyed Doom 3's identity and turned it into a shooter that tries to be a horror game. It's completely missing its core trait and thinks. It so arrogantly thinks that it was superfluous and not the height of its atmosphere. BFG does not improve combat because the ammo count has been tripled on every difficulty, and everything dies far quicker. So combined with removing the darkness's atmosphere and gameplay effects, you have one of the driest, least interesting shooters of its era. There's no struggle here whatsoever. F.E.A.R 2 feels like Takeshi's Challenge by comparison. Enemies still spawn in your face, they're just nowhere near as strong and take way less effort to kill. So instead of being frightened or upset that something spawned in my face, I'm basically just swatting a fly away. The core aspects of why I dislike the combat are still here, just softened. You know how most HD remakes or remasters of older PS2 titles add the ability to skip cutscenes? BFG has it in reverse. You can't skip any of the cutscenes in this version because I believe they're tied to how the game loads levels? Granted, this means the dedicated loading zones are barely an inconvenience with their 2-second load times, but was this really the best course of action? To remove a quality of life feature? What is this, a video game remaster? There are so many little things I could nitpick about this release, but ultimately, it comes down to a simple question. Do you prefer the flatline consistency of BFG or the more unstable ups and downs of OG3? I really can't imagine myself ever completing a full campaign playthrough of BFG. I think it removes what I liked about 3, and what's left feels like table scraps, and I'm not eating them. I honestly can't decide how I feel about Doom 3. Is it a bad game? No way. Is it good? Kind of. I don't think I like this game when I analyze it by the sum of its parts, but looking at those parts individually inspires a lot more appreciation from me. So I guess I like bits and pieces of it. I've got to go back to this one on my own time. It's really bugging me. Again, I really want to hear what comments have to say about Doom 3, because I'm predicting that plenty of people will talk about how much they also dislike the game, and the ones who really love this game are probably going to show up at my door in the middle of the night. What did it release after Doom 3? Oh, okay. You want a game that'll put some hair in your chest? One that cracks you over the head with a bat and tells you to pony up and deal with whatever it throws at you? One that'll push your limits well beyond what you are capable of and have you screaming out in adrenaline as your muscles reconfigure to account for the tectonic level of reaction time and agility needed to clear its horrifying and varied courses? If you said yes, then I can recommend no better game than Painkiller Black Edition. Now we're getting to some real hardcore entries that'll change your brain chemistry and leave you begging for more. This ain't one of your little brother's movement shooters. This is a game for some real hardcore, 3 Days Grace and Judas Priest listening, day drinking sadists looking for a challenge. Painkiller is the epitome of a cult classic, released back in 2004, which is really starting to look like the renaissance for FPS games. By People Can Fly, a Polish studio made famous by one of their later releases, Bulletstorm, and no one does FPS games like the Europeans do. People Can Fly looked at the trend of shooter games slowing down and taking time to smell the roses and said, "Hold my żywiec." Painkiller not only ignores all those trends, but intentionally advertises itself as a homage to the shooters of old, inspired by series like Quake and especially Serious Sam, so I think you know where this is going. Painkiller is a very loud and proud arena shooter, a genre defined by a linear gauntlet of levels that are split into several sections where the only method of progression is killing everything in sight and moving on. That may sound like every shooter game ever made, but the distinctions are found in the approach and presentation of said gauntlets. Instead of having a handful of enemies lurking around a level you need to go find and kill, arena shooters will lock you in a specific area and throw them all at you either in waves or all at once, and Painkiller favors the latter. But make no mistake, you aren't locked in these rooms with a bunch of monsters. They're locked in with you. Painkiller not only emulates the shooters of old, it simplifies, perhaps even distills that core gameplay down to its rawest, most animalistic components. There are no puzzles or keys present, just you, your guns, and targets. And I couldn't be happier. Not for a second are you ever intentionally distracted by something superfluous. Painkiller is one of the leanest shooting games I've ever had the pleasure of playing, no doubt because the core running and gunning, however simplistic, has not been reduced, but refined because of its simplicity. The selection of weapons we have at our hands is phenomenal, one of the most brutal kits ever in the genre. It mixes familiar weapons like shotguns, crossbows, machine guns, but spins them in a completely original and multifaceted way to always keep you on your toes. Not only do these weapons look vicious in a way only a medieval weapon can, every one of them has an alternate fire that does something radically different and allows for some diabolical mix and matching that prevents subsequent playthroughs from feeling the exact same. Your typical shotgun kicks like a mule and does exactly what you think it does, but when you combine it with a freeze shot alt fire that stops any foe in place, you suddenly have a reliable 1-2 tap weapon that stops even the beefiest foes in their attacks with a guaranteed one-shot combo. The obligatory rocket launcher minigun weapons in every FPS are now the same piece of hardware. There's a shuriken launcher attached to a lightning gun that works exactly like Ratchet & Clank's Tesla Claw. Even the melee weapon, the Painkiller, yes, that's partly the reason why the game is called Painkiller, works like a chainsaw with a retractable projectile that hits stronger than most of the guns do. My personal favorite is by far the auto-reloading stake gun, which hits like a truck so long as you account for its trajectory, and the alt-fire is a grenade launcher that fires arcing bombs. Nailing some helpless sod across the map and watching all 4 of his limbs and his head fly off into the air gives me unparalleled satisfaction. Look at the corpse nailed to the wall. Gotta love that. Oh yeah, the ragdoll physics of this game are out of control. The physics in general, which was the selling point of this game upon release, are bizarrely flippant and highly sensitive, thanks to the proprietary Pain engine. You can bump into foliage and send it flying with so much as a gentle nudge. Apply a black and white filter and you're basically watching an M-rated cut of an old Buster Keaton flick. All of Painkiller's weapons are easily digestible in their first use and cover a lot of the same ground, so only having 5 weapon slots seems pretty reasonable, but since each alt-fire does something completely different, that 5 becomes 10. Choosing what primary and alternate fires to string together is what makes the bulk of Painkiller's strategies and replayability. To look at 2 similar features and determine which one is more useful in a microsecond, though personal preference can just as easily be a valid option. The freeze shot travels a long distance, so you can pair it with the stake gun to kill someone on a high-up ledge that's shooting tricky arrows. Rockets can knock away a shield before a simple shotgun blast and can secure a kill. Shurikens can crowd control while lightning can vaporize a tougher foe. There is an unprecedentedly fantastical level of experimentation allowed to suit any playstyle. Close quarters, distance, melee only, anything goes. Painkiller employs a lot more weapon hotkeys than most games, giving you instant access to your melee or the grenade launcher before it auto-swaps back to whatever you were previously using without impeding you. A ton of time was put into the combat's overall cohesiveness. The power fantasy only stops if you die, which is a sign of a job well done. None of these weapons are dead weight, which is especially impressive. Nothing is more telltale of old school inspiration than bee-hopping, and Painkiller's usage of the mechanic is simple but rich. Bee-hopping has a storied history that's decades old and continues to be used and expanded upon a lot of the newer movement shooters of late 2010s and early 2020s, but Painkiller makes it an integral part of combat by only requiring you to hold a single directional key while hopping to build up and maintain a blistering momentum that allows you to dance in between projectiles and waves of enemies with ease as you locate the nearest supply of ammo. Look at how fast I'm going, it's absurd. You don't have to bee-hop if you really don't feel like it, but this was ostensibly the way the game was meant to be played. You will find yourself a very glaring target if you don't, and most arenas are laid out enough to give you enough space to bounce wherever you'd like at a moment's notice, which were also designed in conjunction with the game's soul collection mechanic, which is definitely one of the more ill-implemented ones. Each time something dies, they drop a putrid green soul you can collect to tick up a single point of health and contribute to your overall soul collection. Once it reaches 66, you activate what's called Demon Morph, where you're impervious to all forms of enemy damage and insta-kill everything with some kind of unrelenting, compelling force as the game goes all sad Satan on you. Gotta say, this is the scariest rage mode I've seen in any game. The soundtrack stops as the screams of the damned fill your ears as you savagely blow things to chunks with the force of a cannonball. In theory, this is your devil trigger mode to pull out in a pinch when you're overwhelmed, but it's unfortunately too clunky to make consistent use of. It only lasts for 20 seconds, which really isn't that long. I've almost never been able to clear a room in that time, so you only get to go demon time on a select handful of enemies before you have to try and bee-hop to the next group on such a strict timer. The filters all over the screen make it unnecessarily difficult to actually see where anything is, despite enemies being highlighted in bright red. They still blend into the buildings. I can't believe I'm saying it, but I actually wish they added X-ray vision. Solely because even a single second spent looking for an enemy rather than killing it is a second that feels like pounding nails into my eyes from unfathomable disappointment. 66 souls isn't a demanding number to collect, but it happens automatically once you collect the 66th soul, which means you can absolutely activate it by accident in an empty room and totally waste the opportunity. I get why there isn't a manual activation button. Someone on the dev team might have thought it interrupted the ever-important flow of combat, but I think simply pressing a key to turn it on would make this far more useful than having to plan out when to touch souls and when not to. Souls also dissipate extremely quickly, so you have to hop on over to the corpse of the enemy you just killed to collect it. This isn't always possible because their corpse can fly up in the air and make their souls unreachable, and you have to wait for the corpse to decompose, a 10-second process, which often means throwing yourself headfirst into crowds in order to do so, warping the song and dance of combat into more of a tug-of-war between approaching and fleeing enemies. I don't think that's entirely a bad thing, but the definitive drawback of this feature is that it hurts and overcomplicates what should have been a very simple mechanic and turns it into something so situational I wouldn't blame you for forgetting you can ever do it. Thankfully, we aren't shooting the same enemies over and over again. Painkiller takes an extremely bold approach with its enemy design by having every single level include new ones that support the level's overall motifs, most of the time, which makes every level not only feel fresh and original, but also gives you continuously new challenges to overcome. You have to learn on the spot how each enemy works in each level, learn how they attack and behave in order to dodge whatever they can do, and deal with them most effectively on their own, and in crowds, because depending on the quantity of said foe, their difficulty can range dramatically. It's not hard to deal with one ninja, but a dozen of them? Different story. Mind you, most enemies accomplish the same general things, most of them have a melee and a projectile attack, and they often share the same core animations, but with enough minor differences between them to never feel stale or entirely derivative of each other. See, some enemies explode upon defeat, but some of them do that by committing seppuku instead of running towards you kamikaze style. Some classes of enemies are designed to sit on high-up perches and throw stuff at you, but the properties of those projectiles entirely depend on what specific enemy you're facing rather than a universal thing you can retain throughout the whole game. We've got a lot to love here. Mutilated asylum patients, cartoon witches, Jude the dude from Mad world. World War II soldiers, everyone feels completely distinct and like they stemmed from whatever passing interest the character designers had on any particular day, which can strike some as inconsistent and especially demanding for a player to learn or retain, but when I say new enemies are introduced per level, it's a maximum of 2 or 3. And please remember that arena shooter enemies die very quickly, so once you've seen them attack once or twice, that should be all you need to learn their patterns and circumvent them. It's not like the game is immune from reusing enemies, but it's so sparing that you might not even notice it the first time around. Except for these knights, they pop up a lot more than I appreciate. You're going to need all that knowledge because holy fuck, Painkiller is hard. Enemies may die fast, but you can die faster. When I said this was an arena shooter, I really meant that. You are positively swamped with encounters at every turn and need to employ lightning fast thinking, expert level reaction time, and uncorrupted animal instincts to progress each level in all 5 chapters without tearing your hair out and bee-hopping off a building. Individual attacks don't do that much damage, but those numbers quickly multiply because you're always facing things by the dozen, and they can spawn in front of you, on ledges, behind you, anywhere at all. And this is pronounced from the very first level. That sounds completely unpalatable, but never forget that you're playing as an overdog. You are considerably faster, have more range, and hit far harder. These layouts and enemy formations are intimidating, but more than easily exploited through all those skills you should be building as a natural progression of the game, something that forces you to acknowledge that there was a respectable amount of temperance put into teaching you the core mechanics without letting you drown in the deep end immediately. But you know what the real biggest threats are to your life? Exploding barrels, foliage, and fall damage. There are very severe consequences to overplaying your hand and zipping around too recklessly. You also need to know when not to bee-hop and stand your ground, otherwise your attempts to flee from one group leads you into the arms of the next. Each arena is marked with a mandatory checkpoint that saves your game and heals your health depending on your difficulty. So facing each threat one at a time is incredibly fair and forgiving as far as the genre goes, and each encounter lasts no longer than a couple minutes, so I wasn't usually exhausted going from one to the next. Plus you get some time to soak up each level's atmosphere between arenas. To not mention this game's absolutely shredding soundtrack would be a crying shame. Over a dozen different instrumental metal compositions rip and roar in your ears as you slaughter monsters by the hundreds. A screaming love letter to the late 80s and early 90s era of thrash metal that was very outdated by 2004, but remains a charming fixture of an era long past, and all of these songs sound great. Each level has a unique win condition to unlock a tarot card, which you can equip so long as you've been collecting gold throughout the levels and swap out to give additional gameplay effects, reducing damage, increasing fire rate, or even slowing down time. These are good fun, but the actual win conditions required to obtain them are often so specific and unreasonably demanding that I either slaved away trying to get them, or took one look at a request to finish a level with only my melee or find all secret areas in the level and told it to get bent. I hardly ever had to use tarot cards. The game works well enough on its own, except for a few little snags. The levels themselves were a delight to explore. Really weird comparison to make, but the level select menu feels like a Crash Bandicoot warp room. Not aesthetically, I don't remember the last time I saw anything like this in Crash Bandicoot, but in terms of the total lack of consistency in visuals and locations between each world and level. Whatever the developers thought was cool was turned into a level and put right next to the last one with zero hesitation or cohesion. You'll go from an abandoned prison to an opera house to a snowy bridge with no connecting tissue other than ripping and tearing your way through them. But since there was so much effort into designing specific enemies for each level to act as set pieces, I think this is also a strength of the game rather than a weakness. It leaves me so excited to see what's next. It leans fully into being a gothic pastiche shooter. Some of the architecture of these levels still look pretty good. It's easily capable of being grand or unnerving. Level length or even the amount of levels per chapter is also wildly up in the air. There's 5 levels in chapter 1, then 4 in chapter 2, then back to 5 and 3. Some of these levels are 10 minutes, while others are an agonizing 30. Because of this, difficulty is kind of all over the place. and some levels are way harder than others, which is especially pronounced depending on their chapter placement. Most of the endgame levels really aren't that hard, but the prison level, the first level of chapter 2, took me 40 minutes to beat. See those turrets? No, exactly. That's why it took me so long. I'm starting to think I have a problem with turrets. It's a pretty massively flawed, horrible type of level at the end of each chapter. The game's most glaring, unforgiving aspect is how poorly designed the boss fights are. My god. I will say they're an absolute spectacle to look at. They're all gigantic and shake the earth with each step. It's a really fun David and Goliath feeling, but then you remember you aren't David. All of these boss fights have some stupid, unthinkable method required to beat them that you will almost never be able to guess. But they also have attacks that aren't just strong enough to one-tap you, they can just as easily disorient you or use the environment against you in ways you are woefully unequipped to counter. But the boss fight against this guy, Alistair, embodies not only every problem with the game's boss fights, but nearly every problem in the game. Firstly, you fight him on 4 different floors, and you take mandatory fall damage after each one breaks, which for me translated to a variable between 40 and 70 HP. Secondly, the pain engine's ability to destroy the environment through these crumbling marble pillars really bites you in the ass because it creates a totally unreasonable amount of things that stop you in your tracks and prevent you from moving whatsoever. They can also just squash you at a moment's notice, which means you can get very easily stuck between 2 objects when you're trying to strafe it around an arena to avoid attacks and collect ammo. So you end up taking the full brunt of a flame breath attack because you're trapped between 2 objects you had no way of predicting or circumventing, and you just die. That attack doesn't even do much damage, but it will kill you when you are either completely trapped through no fault of your own, or something suddenly falls right in front of you and completely kills your momentum. Thirdly, the final drop to the 4th floor takes 75 to 80 hit points off in Nightmare difficulty mode, the one I'm playing. So not only do I need to be at 100 health to even survive the descent, I need to not get hit at all in order to keep my health at 100, which is exceedingly difficult to do because of variables I have basically no ways to influence. I'm struggling to communicate how bone-twistingly unfun this was to play. You almost have to use tarot to progress through this one part. It's the only time I really had to. The difficulty's completely scattershot. Boss 4 is the hardest in the game, but the 3rd boss only requires you to shoot at his hammer to kill him. Boss 2 is this stupid swamp monster puzzle boss where you have to shoot at these bubbles to... God, it's all awful. I always skip these stages when I replay the game. It's such a steep low point in an otherwise entertaining time. The final boss is the easiest one because it's a dumb gimmick fight rather than a test of your skills. Don't think I haven't forgotten that this video is about horror games, because Painkiller is perfectly able to scare the hell out of me when it wants to. Look at the asylum level. It's much more cramped than anywhere else, and it forces you to carefully navigate rooms of mutilated patients and exploding monsters. The menus and UI share a fiery, demonic look. Loading bars are bright brimstone orange, and buttons hiss at you when you click them. There's an occult undercurrent found in the fonts, the theming, the overall vibe of this game to make the entire adventure feel like a contract with the devil, because that's basically what it's about. People love to make memes and jokes about how Doomguy is what God sends to scourge hell and massacre demons, but these new gens don't know about the sheer terror hell has for the merciless onslaught that Daniel Garter is capable of. Painkiller is his nickname, and everyone above and below fears him. Our story opens on Daniel and his wife Catherine dying in a car accident and being sent to the afterlife. Catherine goes right to heaven, but Daniel is stuck in purgatory for 30 years. Until he makes a deal with an angel, Samael, to wipe out Lucifer and his 4 generals to finally end a seemingly ceaseless war between heaven and hell. The story isn't exactly complicated, but it is involved. There are these gorgeously clunky CGI cutscenes after each boss fight that tell a story full of betrayal, subterfuge, and demonic influence. It has some genuinely good lines that caught me off guard. It's like watching a gothic Tekken 1 cutscene. It's great.
Is he going to solve anything? Jesus. That's not going to impress him either.
There aren't any bodies buried here. They use graves like these as their primary entrance into this world. However, it's not clear which graves are actually used.
What are you doing here then?
I dig graves.
There's a surprising amount of lore you need to remember for each cutscene. Character relationships change frequently. Daniel has shifting alliances with Eve, the biblical Eve, a demon buddy of his named Asmodeus, and Samael. There's a lot more going on than you'd ever expect for a game like this. They really nailed the feeling of being a spiritual pawn in a much bigger plan devised by God. It's quite eerie. Since this is an old school style game, you need to play in the highest difficulty to unlock the best ending. But outside of the boss fights, I don't think that's entirely unreasonable, but it certainly isn't easy. The biggest flaw with this game has been staring me in the face the whole time. Its repetitiveness. Once you beat level 1, every stage aside from a boss fight plays almost exactly the same. Run around each level looking for checkpoints, clear waves of enemies, move on to the next. A lot of people say that it becomes stale instantly due to a lack of deviation, and I totally understand where people are coming from. It's not for everyone. It's definitely more brainless and requires less patience than something like Serious Sam, but this type of shooter is right up my clear alley. It's an acquired taste, but Painkiller is 100% aware of this and does not attempt to be anything other than itself, which is what keeps me coming back. It all comes down to if you like doing this enough to do it for 7 hours. And I do, but in spurts. Playing this game in one sitting is not something I recommend. Enjoy it like fast food, whenever you get the urge, otherwise you're gonna gorge on and puke. A lot of people stick their nose up at it because it's edgy, but who cares? That's awesome. I'd rather Daniel take his tasks seriously than be constantly spouting sarcastic lines to mildly entertain the player. Daniel doesn't say much outside of cutscenes other than... So, that's Painkiller for you. It reviewed well for the time and is still remembered by enough uncles and Russians to immortalize its cult classic status, but it's kind of been left in the dust as far as legacy shooters go, probably because of the hefty amount of Euro jank that lines this game's pockets. Outside of levels just not loading for some reason, I can tolerate it, but I know it's a big deal breaker for some. I like to give statements on what happened to the game series and creators I'm covering if applicable, but Painkiller's fate is so tragic that it makes F.E.A.R's look Edenic. What's worse, a series of bad games and management issues killing your franchise, or having that franchise shamble on as a zombified shell of its former self? Painkiller got an overwhelming 5 expansion packs, 1 DLC pack for the original, and 4 standalone games made by different studios. Hell Wars was a fairly basic level and weapon expansion that was combined with the original game to make the Black Edition for PC, but also Painkiller Hell Wars, a console port exclusively released on the original Xbox, which mixes up levels from the OG and its DLC due to a lack of space. There are a couple console releases, but Painkiller is primarily a PC-only series, which is the platform I recommend to this day. With the exception of maybe Overdose, all of these standalone games are ludicrously worse than the original because they were made by teams with almost no capabilities in game design or balancing. So every encounter is just shooting droves of copy-pasted enemies down a linear hallway with literally no other course of action to do, or you fall through the floor and can't beat the game at all. I'm serious, stay away from these. There was also a pseudo-remake of the first game in 2012 called Painkiller Hell and Damnation, and I call it a pseudo-remake because they didn't feel like remaking each level, so it featured a third of the original content for twice the price, which is just wonderful. The game doesn't play that bad, but it's a disappointing release that didn't kick up any dust for the franchise's name. 2025 gave us another remake of Painkiller, but it's Painkiller in name only. This is an atrocious reimagining, which is a more polite way of saying raping, because nothing that made the original game good here is present at all. I bought this for maybe $25 4 months after release, so clearly this was not the slam dunk return of a cult classic anyone wanted. There are more bad Painkiller games than good ones, which makes me consider swapping my Painkiller game addiction for a real one. Here's my recommendation for the Painkiller play order. Play Black Edition, maybe Overdose, play the 2012 remake if you really can't get enough of the series, then play Necrovision and then Witchfire, the latter being made by former People Can Fly devs who previously made The Vanishing of Ethan Carter. I had no idea they made that. couldn't write an intro to this game if I tried. Just look at it. What am I supposed to say? Golden Light is a game, experienced, possibly haunted piece of software by independent developer Mr. Pink Dev, a self-described evil creep making games, and just a single glance at any of his wares upgrades his statement from satirical to empirical. When I first played Golden Light, I went in as blind as possible, and I recommend you do the same, because the first hour you spend being utterly stumped and threatened as you try to glean how this game even works is a far better introductory vehicle than scouring the various wiki pages available. The environments kinda speak for themselves, don't they? Well, too bad I'm telling you about them anyways. Look at how sickly red and brown everything is, how the walls seem to breathe, how a living, conscious, thinking darkness enshrouds and permeates the entire complex you writhe through. Golden Light takes the high road on a scarlet red Oregon trail ripped straight from Terraria's crimson biome, and translates it into a scatological network of hallways and office boardrooms bound by sinews and teeth that all jiggle and cry out in agony as you furtively sidle over them. Walls can be made entirely out of flesh, objects are often smeared and coated in it. The whole world feels like a series of pictures taken from a home decor catalog, photographed and formatted entirely by Saya. Things made of and collected in flesh still vaguely resemble what they once were. It doesn't matter if this bicycle is a living creature that can and will speak to you. If you mount him, it's still a bike. You could even ride it. But ride him? I don't know. There are charred spots of dark flesh that spout spikes when you touch them, hands hanging from the ceiling. Golden Light is a viscerally disgusting video game to look at, let alone to explore and play. Even the substances and locations that aren't caked in flesh appear moldy and grimy, like they'd leave a filmy substance on your fingertips if you grazed them. I really can't emphasize the term world enough because despite how openly hostile and revolting everything is, life still finds a way to exist, even if only out of spite. There are still recognizable locations and concepts, just run through 10 different filters to feel like a Yog-Sothothian commissioned Benadryl trip and corrupted rather than completely alien. Objects like maps actively speak to the player through their twisted anthropomorphized forms. Things that have no mouths will talk your ear off. There's a total breakdown between dream logic and reality, only aided by the game's impeccable sound design. I can't even describe it, just take a listen. It's unfathomably difficult to try and explain how the first hour of gameplay works. Twisting and turning through these cramped, dark corridors while picking up bullets and pieces of gold feels so unnatural because Golden Light rarely wants to explain itself, and when it does, it's always backhanded and cryptic. Scattered notes you find throughout use strange syntax and refer to objects and characters well before the player ever sees them. It's profoundly unfriendly in a stylish and intimidating way, but not overwhelming so that it snuffs out the desire to explore head first. There's a very respectable usage of low-poly models that sits well outside the realm of being a ploy to evoke some sense of nostalgia or skimp out on detailing. The harsher edges on character models only improve the already present off-putting attitude. It resists the temptation to go full homage territory by making those intentionally flat faces on character models. Golden Light isn't trying to look bad to fit in with games from the 90s. It has an original spin and usage of the aesthetic under the low-poly umbrella, which I really appreciate. To put things into perspective how chaotic and unpredictable this game is, I had a long, one-sided conversation with someone known as She, parkoured over desks, found a handful of keys, threw a fish head and caused a wildfire and got chased by a living vending machine. That is how the first 15 minutes of Golden Light started for me, and the paranoia and awe that it inspired demanded I stick around for more. So I ate Eris's golden apple of discord and let it lead me by the hand throughout the gut, the sprawling nightmare dungeon that makes up the literal meat and figurative potatoes of Golden Light's gameplay. I began to pick up some weapons, some melee, some firearms, and was quickly introduced to this game's shocking roster of monsters, primarily these mimics called piles of meat, and their name isn't just for show. Anything between a stack of books, a potted plant, almost any medium-sized object can instantly morph into a towering pile of meat ready to smother you at a moment's notice. They definitely feel like Prey 2017's Typhons, but with a healthy dosage of prop hunt nonsense. Look at how they slide and hop around in their disguised forms like a pyro's right behind them. I can't decide if these things are either hilarious or terrifying, which is a pretty common debate in the courtroom of my mind. But I can't filibuster this point. Golden Light has incredibly meandering and lackluster combat. Swinging pipes or shooting guns works exactly how you think they do, but I feel like every single enemy in the game takes up a completely unreasonable amount of screen real estate to a degree that isn't just disorienting, but tedious. There's absolutely nothing stopping every single mimic in a particular area from swarming you all at once while they cover the entire screen, leaving you with little option other than to blindly swing and pray you kill them in time. You can always attack them when they're in their harmless disguises, but getting the drop on them only nets you maybe one good attack? And if whatever you're holding isn't some especially threatening juju, you're in trouble. You'll learn the swing speed of each melee weapon as you play, but that didn't stop me from having a miserable experience the first time around with everything because you have no certainty in achieving a kill. Does that positively impact the overall feeling of helplessness and dread? Indeed. But does that mean I enjoy combat at all? Nope. It has the stiffness of old-school From Software combat, but the constantly shifting panic found in Condemn's wide array of brittle weaponry you need to constantly be swapping out. But even Condemn didn't have them break apart this easily. Golden Light has some of the most aggressive weapon deterioration I've ever seen in any game. You get like 7 swings with each weapon before it breaks and becomes inert, forcing you to do one of several things. You can throw the item for a last hurrah of damage, or eat it to recover health. Look, I just gobbled up that axe like it was nothing, and it was delicious enough to restore some health. Fancy that. All weapons, and items for that matter, have various uses and functions outside of just directly using them for combat, and all of these range from useful to insanely annoying. We have a collection of status effects like fire or poison, but the indication of said statuses is also something you have to learn by experiencing, because Laughing Man, fire seems pretty obvious in retrospect, but it can be hard to tell what text matters and what text is entirely superfluous noise. There is an inordinate amount of it that is thrilled to invade your screen whenever you do something, and the difference between purely stylistic and something you need to pay attention to is not something you'll likely understand in the first several runs. Actually, this is how you're told that enemies can hear you and details the last thing you've hit, but you probably wouldn't have guessed it the first time around because it jiggles like a Movie Maker slideshow effect. All of this culminated in me kicking the bucket early on and ending up in a place called the Eternal Field, where I could collect a few more weapons, explore this little area for items you can eat to restore health, and that's when it dawned on me with the subtlety of being charged by a rhinoceros. Golden Light is a roguelike. Roguelite? Whatever. Each time you die, you're brought here and have to start your descent throughout the gut from the beginning, which is floor -1. Had I led with the fact it's a roguelike, people would have tempered their expectations immediately and begin operating in roguelike mode, when the extremely recommended approach is to go in totally blind. Discovering the mechanics and the ways items intersect is so much more interesting than just reading the wiki before you play, but that option is available. These buttons on the menu, scariest part of the game. Clicking on this and being led to a Discord invite made my blood run cold. And the wiki page is a fandom page, so I can't sincerely recommend you touch it with a 50-foot pole. Unless you love drowning in advertisements that would have gotten your webpage banned 15 years ago. Jimmy Wales' demonic presence is probably what formed the gut in the first place. How are the actual roguelike elements now that the cat is not only out of the bag, but skinned and cut up for us to appraise? Golden Light is exceptionally lenient and forgiving, mostly because the Eternal Fields hold a ton of weapons, health-restoring items, and mementos, which act as your temporary power-ups or effects you maintain throughout a run, though each floor can just as easily carry one for you to stack up to a staggering total of 50 at one time. These mementos aren't just straight damage buffs, they are hyper-specific and often contain a downside, making them more of a careful trade-off rather than something you can simply acquire. You can keep some mementos after you die or remove them with some additional items, but I've yet to find any. Each area you explore is procedurally generated and asks you to find either 2 or 3 keys in order to access this glowing elevator so you can find individual corpse parts of your wife or friend, whoever she is, before moving on to another segment. There's a pretty spectral story going on, but it's the kind of narrative you need explained to you by a YouTuber, not something I think that can be enjoyed solely through the vague hints and bits of symbolism you're drip-fed throughout the adventure, and I couldn't tell you what's going on. Golden Light saves key items like corpse parts, so you only use your weaponry, healing items, and mementos when you die, and you can upgrade yourself slowly to last longer and fall into that roguelike loop pretty quickly. So the TLDR is to collect keys and move down the gut, but I really struggled to progress because, well, I don't like roguelikes. I don't like losing everything and starting back at the beginning, and even if Golden Light's take on the genre feels fine enough, it was never going to satisfy me. Even now that I know dying is a mandatory part of the adventure that facilitates you obtaining stronger gear and mementos, the fundamental issues I have with Golden Light's combat are still present. What's the fun of having an ultra strong weapon if it just breaks apart in a few seconds and forces me to find something else on that very floor? If there even is a weapon, because that isn't a guarantee. There are some quirky NPCs we can make deals with using the gold we pick up to upgrade weapons or buy new ones and all that jazz, but it settles into that irksome casino that people call the roguelike genre pretty hard. I was never down with the feeling that completing the game should be a result of a good run, rather than something I have more direct control over, if that makes any sense. Once you collect all 3 keys, every single monster in that area jolts towards you, so it becomes a mad dash just to get to the elevator and unlock all the locks. And if you can't do that in time, oops, gotta start over. Sorry. There's a pretty lengthy load time between each floor too. I don't know if you can skip it somehow, but it makes barreling through a whole biome supremely more timely than it should have been. Thankfully, running away from monsters is usually just as valid an option. Your sprint speed is kind of piddling, but your spacebar is a sort of vault that carries a pleasing amount of momentum that can launch you well out of the clutches of something. So I ended up running away from most encounters, but that won't save you from each biome's boss fight. From what I've gathered, Golden Light has a lot more to offer in terms of visuals and locations, but I enjoyed this game more as an audio-visual experience rather than a compelling dungeon-crawling survival horror experience. Something I've got to give props to is the fact that there's not just a multiplayer mode, but an online mode. Let's give it a shot. My game crashed. Mr. Pink has made a couple other games besides Golden Light, a retro arena shooter and an upcoming zombie colony simulator, so it's good to know he keeps busy. These games all fit pretty cleanly into a subgenre with a descriptive term that defines what they're all about in order to better categorize and advertise them. Blood is a boomer shooter, Painkiller is an arena shooter, etc. But every so often, you get a game that deviates so radically from the established grain and is so unconcerned with following crowds that neatly classifying it is impossible. It exists in an awkward limbo state of comparisons to the closest examples you can recall. When I tell you Realms of the Haunting is an FPS, point-and-click, FMV adventure puzzle game hybrid, you're going into debt with how much attention you're going to be paying. You'd think that all of these descriptive terms would make this a jarring, broken mess of a game with a completely schizophrenic sense of progression and identity, but no. I am delighted to report that not only do all of these elements connect together ever so smoothly, they soar to make something truly remarkable. Realms of the Haunting was designed by the British masterminds at Gremlin Interactive, yes, that is their name, for MS-DOS back in late 96. Like every British PC gaming developer back in the 80s and early 90s, they mostly toiled around on the ZX Spectrum until they started working on graphic adventure games. But every game I found under their name looks like some bizarro world product from a far-off universe that exists outside the general sensibilities of the average consumer. Some people might remember the platforming series Zool for Amiga, which was designed to be Sonic the Hedgehog at home, or maybe Loaded, a PS1 and Sega Saturn twin-stick shooter with character designs from Garth Ennis, so maybe it makes sense our playable roster of characters features a man dressed as a baby? Realms of the Haunting was their most expensive project, and the FMV cutscenes at the beginning undoubtedly demonstrate that. Most of the story is told through these cutscenes featuring live-action actors imposed onto 3D modeled backgrounds that, I'm really not kidding when I say this, somehow look better than Phantasmagoria's, which is hilarious considering the budgets both of them had. The video quality is worse. Sometimes the actors kind of blend into the screen and cause their facial features to become mystifyingly obscured, but I guess that only aids in the overall vibe of intrigue the whole thing gives off, a delectable sign of passion fueling this project more than purse. Despite the technical limitations and shortcomings, there's quite a bit of cinematography on display. Attention to detail with shadows and overall real actor presence, I got a sense that the camera guys and gals really sweated the small stuff and wanted this to feel like a grand adventure, even if everyone on screen has more scan lines than a CRT. The actors themselves are pretty good, sometimes even great. Acting in FMV games is kind of a put upon topic, and that's not for no reason. The tech was just so new that people weren't entirely sure how to approach this new frontier with a straight face. Destiny could not be manifested quite yet. It wasn't uncommon for these games to star actors who didn't have much experience under their belts, and stage actors were often totally outside the realm of possibility because of budgetary reasons. It wasn't uncommon for developers and other staff members to don a tragicomic mask and do their best with what they had. The actors in Realms all pull their own weight with convincing performances and very consistently deliver the cheesy dialogue with enough determination to not take me out of the experience. They all kind of feel like actors in a higher tier CW show, like seasons 1 through 5 of Supernatural.
Stakes are far greater than you can possibly imagine.
Dad, please. I don't understand.
You must try, my boy. Find out.
Within this place are things that were taken from me. Find them. They will provide a link between us.
You can read minds.
Read minds, psychic, call it what you will, it's a gift. And I am here to help you. And you do need help, don't you?
I don't know what I need.
Adam!
The main character, Adam, gives me some serious Hayden Christensen, Anakin Skywalker vibes, and I doubt I'm the only one who thinks that. But what's he doing out here in the first place? Adam has to visit this creepy old mansion out in the middle of nowhere after he received crumbled remains of some amulets that have been giving him strange dreams about the fate of his recently deceased father. And what's a better introduction to a puzzle-solving video game than exploring an old mysterious mansion connected to your dead daddy? The point-and-click puzzle-solving deviates itself far away from Myst-likes by allowing you to explore this 3D environment seamlessly with a very Ultima Underworld feel to it, where you can roam as you please and aren't limited to exploring a few squares on a grid for progression. The arrow keys are how you'll be moving around, while the mouse clicks on objects to provide some commentary or store items in your inventory, which is a separate menu and not something conveniently on display like Ultima Underworld, sadly. It's a mercifully simple control scheme and menu, with dedicated sections for weaponry, puzzle items, etc., with most of those objects having separately rendered models and descriptions we can chew on. There's even a whole character section that gives us additional details about ourselves and the game's various NPCs that updates with each major plot revelation, which I really appreciate. The environments are eerie, but also grandiose. Light sources play a key component in this game, often being the catalyst for activating puzzles and totally changing the vibe of each location. And the locations we get to frolic in are nothing short of sublime. Grand mansion interior with all its hallways and guest rooms and studies and vacant suits of armor feel eloquent and inviting, but secret passageways reveal entrances to marble dungeons and mausoleums and ancient ritual rooms with towering stone statues that emanate nefarious plots. We don't stay in the mansion for too long before we start going to outdoor locations and other universes. Very long story. That all carry this really gorgeous vintage look that makes it feel right at home with all these retro-styled Kingsfield-likes, with all their harsh edges and otherworldly ambiences that look like a pre-rendered memory from my childhood. The entire map is interconnected and cohesive, but you'll never know what general vibe or aesthetic you'll wander to next. It captures the same dungeon-crawling satisfaction of an old-school Elder Scrolls game while still ostensibly remaining a puzzle-focused adventure. We've got locked doors, hidden passageways that need a key item, runic doors. There's a lot going on throughout these crypts and underground castles, and you should really be abusing your save files because boldly exploring can often lead to your death. If you didn't pick up the right item in a prior room, this game is not afraid to kill you on the spot if you wander too far. There's an entree of wonderful 90s PC game design served throughout Realms' exploration and puzzle solving to make for quite a full course. There are essentially no clues or hints or suggestions on where to go or what to do outside of a direct command from an NPC in a cutscene. Maybe it was in the manual, I didn't really check. You really need to be self-motivated and click on every object in a particular room in order to find out where to go. There's no shame in using a guide here, especially if you need help finding extra ammo or health. The low resolution of MS-DOS games thankfully doesn't hinder the adventure too much here. The environments still look quite pleasing thanks to great color selection and careful interior design, but trying to read any of the optional letters you find is made nearly impossible because of how small the text is. Look at that. No deepest lore learning here. I don't know if these exist in higher quality somewhere online or in the original big box release, but they all look like chicken scratch. Plus the maps are kind of hard to follow, but I've yet to explore an area in-game that was too complicated, so I don't see it as too much of an issue. Combat in this game is contentious for some because it's primarily done by the keyboard. I have the attack button bound to F, so I'm swirling around with the arrow keys while hammering down F. Most enemies in this game are truant enough to not make this too much of a frustration, thankfully. Every monster that roams these halls gives off a serious build engine appearance. Even the handgun weapon feels like it was ripped from Duke Nukem. I never felt like I ever hit a precise shot on anything, which is probably for the better because aiming sort of feels like tracing the outline of a protractor at school rather than something I did with skill and intent. This isn't really a survival horror shooter game. Enemies are just another type of obstacle to overcome, so the shooting and melee combat is simple but doesn't get in the way of anything else. There are various types of firearms and handheld weapons to use on different enemies. There are hidden ammo compartments. It doesn't detract from the puzzle solving because Adam has two main equipment slots for interacting with the world, one for weapons and one that can be used for any puzzle item, so it does cut down on some of the inventory management, but you'll still be spending more time in the menus than was probably necessary. There definitely could have been some optimization implemented. There's a reluctantness from going all in on the combat that prevents it from being fully realized, I'm afraid. Reloading is a harsh, timely penalty that ensures you can never play this game with a guns blazing playstyle. You must adopt a sleuthing mindset in order to successfully progress. Check a room for its monster contents, discombobulate them, and eliminate their capacity to rush you down. I actually found the sword weapon you get at the start to be the most useful, provided you stand your guard and know which enemies are slow enough to not react in time to 2 quick slashes. But your kit includes things like shotguns and magical wizard staffs that fire blue plasma balls and kill everything in sight, so there's a lot of room to experiment at your leisure. All of these elements intertwine to make a game that has basic but thrilling combat, deep atmospheric exploration with puzzle solving, and keen appeasement to any boy's inherent sense of adventure, and a compelling family saga epic narrative with FMV cutscenes that feature limited but very present dialogue tree options to boot. A lot of you are expecting the other shoe to drop, prepared to hear something like, "This idea or concept was just too ambitious." But no, everything I've explained works great even. It leans into a sleazy, urban horror fantasy vibe of Gabriel Knight, with a trench-coated protagonist having to square off against ancient demons by blowing their brains out with a handgun. I honestly could not tell you what most of the mook monsters are. They kind of look like vague, racially insensitive Star Wars creatures. Nothing here is perfect, there's always room for improvement, but Realms of the Haunting does the seemingly impossible and skillfully balances all of these elements so neatly that I was in disbelief. I was waiting for something to disappoint me, but it never really did. Nothing overstays its welcome. I never forgot where I was going because the story cutscenes are well-paced rewards for clearing small sections of each dungeon. Nothing here felt unnecessary. Each part is strong enough on its own, but the sum of its parts make for an exceptionally unique experience that stands out in the crowd. I can't say this game is for everyone because I know well enough that its weird mix of gameplay elements are going to rub some people, perhaps even a lot of people, the wrong way, and make the entire adventure feel a little flimsy by comparison to other titles that go all in on just one of Realm's aspects. It was a pretty obscure release that got high reviews, but was suffocated under the bigger name releases of 97. They were going up against Dungeon Keeper and the original Fallout. They had no chance. This is another game I'm hesitant to write out everything I feel about it because it's lining up quite nicely to be the focus of a whole separate video. I have quite a bit more to say. Until then, take this as an example of going outside your wheelhouse by finding something off GOG that costs $3 to play, because I barely knew what Realms of the Haunting was until I did my bi-monthly GOG shopping spree, and now it's one of my highlight plays of 2026. The name No Players Online might send a shock of recollection through a lot of people's systems. And that's because it's the title of a very popular free itch.io horror game designed by a team that would later form Beeswax Games. It was modeled in the style of a classic multiplayer FPS game that's been abandoned for decades, leaving you all on your lonesome exploring a completely empty server that once hosted 1,000 games, but it isn't long until you figure out you aren't as alone as you once thought. Have you ever played an online game in single player and just roamed around all the empty maps with no objectives? Suddenly, these places designed to house 16 to 32 players being completely devoid of any life other than your own screams isolation in a fashion that captures many a Zoomer's mind, myself included. Perhaps the absence of the point forces us to absorb the ambience of these locations without any filters. Our naked minds aren't used to a feeling of isolation this profound chasing us into the realm of interactive fiction. so people tend to feel unease, perhaps even panic at being left to our own devices in worlds meant for amusement that have now become prisons of our own construction. Countless games give people these feelings of interiority. It was a whole cottage industry a couple years ago to explore dead online games with 0 players. And No Players Online was one of the biggest indie releases that capitalized on that concept by creating a world meant to evoke those feelings of ennui for a game you could no longer play. No Players Online is an experience that attempts to bring the postmodern, my video game is haunted cliché from internet creepypastas as a playable experience. The demonstration of this attempt earned it a ton of attention from Let's Players back in 2019 when it was released. I only found out about this game because Mutahar played it, and I'm sure others have their own examples of curators who brought this game to their attention. Little did we know, but this was only an appetizer for the true experience, because an expanded retail edition was released in late 2025, divorced from its game jam origins, and now stands on its own. Let's reconnect to No Players Online. You're completely alone against a backdrop of an old-school 90s FPS game that's been left in the dustbin of someone's computer. Our only task at the beginning is to collect the opposite team's unmanned flag for a very quick round of classic capture the flag. Right from the start, we're hit over the head with the unfinished game aesthetic written all over the blocky, brutalist architecture that was hastily set up in universe as a proof of concept. Our player character is only capable of sprinting and firing an infinite ammo revolver, with no one to shoot at. The timer doesn't work properly, it's a consciously created mess. It feels like a teenager tried to recreate an Unreal Tournament map on his own. It's thematically hackneyed and far too minuscule to ever be a fun map to play. I can't imagine that only having one flank route would make for a very exciting deathmatch. I'm a sucker for ruminating and lonely maps, and No Players Online provides more than a serviceable stomping ground. The map lacks any kind of sound aside from the clanking of your footsteps and the barren wind howling in your ears as you aimlessly trudge back and forth to collect the flag, waiting for something to happen or getting entirely lost in thought. There's a gimmick I'll explain later on that expands upon this map by adding more game mechanics and properties, like adding the ability to jump, a swimming mechanic, and exploding barrels we can shoot. We get to explore some untextured nooks and grayscale crannies tucked away that were previously unreachable to communicate how slapped together everything is. There isn't a ton of space to explore, but the map is condensed enough to still hit the telltale beats of how you should feel playing a multiplayer game with no one else online. But even early on, I started to notice some serious cracks in the overall vibe of the abandoned multiplayer game the title was going for. Since this is indeed an unfinished game, it bugs out constantly. But the bugs we see don't really feel like a gold source title bugging out, they feel like pibby glitches. There's a kind of cleanness and visual clarity, a cinematic approach that betrays the feeling of playing a game held together by duct tape by having it darken dramatically and glow bright red in poignant moments, rather than have a more authentic depiction of garbled textures that I would argue create a more natural kind of suspense and ambience found in seeing a video game freak out. It lacks the surprise and chaotic randomness a bug must have to feel authentic. Seeing a completely inexplicable and sudden visual bug gets my attention a lot more than seeing a recreation of a video game bug with an accompanying sound effect. It's faux and manufactured, though No Players Online is far from the only game with an intentional glitch aesthetic that does this. It's more interested in using this isolation as an expression of horror rather than malaise or contemplativeness, which I feel does the aesthetic a disservice. Look at the difference in the gun designs from the 2019 original to the 2025 expanded edition. The original gun looked exactly like something you'd see in Quake. Why was it retooled into something that looks like it was ripped from Ultra Kill? There are some alternate smaller locations you get to explore later on, but these are hardly anything to chew on and differ so much from what the original map had going for it that they really started to lose me. They feel like translated spooks from the Mandela catalog. There are these grayscale, warped faces on ill-fitting character models, which I'm sure people did find genuinely scary. They were just a total miss for me. The whole game is thickly layered in this warbling, twitching kind of VHS feedback effect that just stings my eyes and makes the game feel more like a parody of the era rather than an appreciative visual depiction of it. Might as well add an Adult Swim logo in the corner to give the illusion of being nonchalant and well-versed in cartoons to fit in. Bad VHS effects and Adult Swim parodies? Who do you think you are? me. And this is a picky complaint, but something about the revolver we have and the way the character moves around really doesn't feel old school to me. It feels too modern. Like Beeswax didn't grab enough reference material for games in that era to nail the especially minute animations and design sensibilities for the time. That time being the 1970s? Huh? A fully 3D computer game in 1973. You're taking the piss. The lore is that the game takes place in the 90s, but the game you're playing was programmed around the 70s and it looks this good. I'm sorry, I don't care how much of an alternate reality timeline deviation the story presents. That is as jarring as giving Pharaoh an iPhone and making him watch Instagram Reels.
I will hear no more of this Hebrew nonsense.
This is supposed to capture a decade 20 years ahead of its time. Why was such a jarring anachronism put there? And speaking of capturing an era, most of this game takes place in a sort of computer interface that allows us limited in-universe internet and folder access, which is how we actually launched the game in question, alongside finding some passwords and clues needed to progress. As far as the actual interface goes, I don't really mind it, even if it does feel like a pacebreaker from the in-game environments. It's cheesy, but gleefully self-aware, though the guys you can look up on the forum site don't drop enough F-bombs to accurately portray forum users at the time, and I think you know what F-word I'm talking about. I'm a sucker for getting to respond to in-game emails though. Even if you can't type out your own message, I like getting to chat with fictional people. It's like the 90s equivalent of being a woman who's addicted to character AI. The CTF map routinely undergoes alterations like I mentioned prior. You sort of combine it with other installed games or one you can additionally download from the forum to transfer its properties, like combining it with a fishing game to gradually flood the map. You can play these games separately, which is a nice touch. There's Minesweeper, a shoddy fishing game, and a 100% wholesome ironic dating sim visual novel. These games can be combined without the shooter game to make some funny gags on their own. The visual novel in particular is such a grievous misstep for me, not just because I personally can't stand the trope of visual novel parodies, but also because combining it with the CTF map, which is a required task, adds an enormous amount of mandatory text required to understand the story going on. I feel that this move totally abandons ship on any visual storytelling the game might have been going for or attempted, which would have made a lot more sense for a very short indie game attempting to replicate a specific point in time. But adding all this narration makes us stop in place and not appreciate the strengths no players online has. We should talk about the story. The story of the original 2019 version was already super put down because even for a 15-minute game, it just felt lame. The story is that the game you played is a sort of virtual prison containing the soul of the developer's dead wife who's been chasing you as a ghost. It was garish and made a lot of people laugh, but I found it serviceable and more than charming that it was delivered to us via the developer communicating with the in-game chat. There was more adherence to in-universe game mechanics. It played to its strengths of taking place within a game, even if the execution didn't land for a lot of people. Now that the 2025 version is more than okay with just delivering a story outside the mechanics of a singular FPS game, that already questionable plot beat is expanded into a full-on melodrama that just so happens to feature a video game. Turns out we're on the map developer's computer. We might be him? I'm actually not sure. That transfers the game's souls to each other, which we can separate and combine like we're in the Cathedral of Shadows. I really like that idea, and it does at least provide a somewhat reasonable explanation how and why this guy's wife died and how her soul was trapped in a crummy FPS game to begin with, but that's not what the bulk of the story is about. What we actually experience is mostly just info dump text boxes about how the two met and their struggling relationship that came from clashing egos and miscommunication. There is an interesting motif of artwork as a creative medium widening the gap between two creative people rather than closing it, but it's so nestled and buried within a core narrative that uses the framing device of old video games and software in such a disappointingly tepid way. Was there no better way to communicate this than by stopping the FPS and just having the player click on random things to get more dry dialogue? How come we couldn't have more map exploration to find spooky areas? Why couldn't these conversations be with NPCs to fit the video game presentation? They really could have just taken the part from Undertale where all the monsters stop attacking you to talk about Azrael had there been even one NPC programmed. What a missed opportunity. To the game's credit, there are some smaller bits of software that do allow us to more proactively move the story along, like one where we play as the guy's wife, Sarah, painting some abstract art pieces, but these moments are tragically far and few between. There's a scene, as in not something you can interact with other than scrolling through dialogue, where Sarah and the main programmer meet for the first time in an art museum and discuss her work, and you know what? This scene sums up my feelings on the game perfectly, if unintentionally. They're abstract and made to be questioned, and then you're beat over the head with the meaning because you are being lectured by the artist who made them. And once those fleeting moments of curiosity fade, you're left with a canvas with a food fight color palette that can never live up to anything you've built up in your mind. No Players Online confidently holds the paintbrush, but once it's time to hang up the artwork, it falls flat on its face. I'm sorry, I just don't get any secondhand nostalgia from this game whatsoever, if that was indeed the intention. This game doesn't feel like the 1990s, or even the 1970s for that matter, but the 90s, a parody of a real time and place formed by attempts to capture a vibe, through the usage of motifs and gags that are either out of place or do not communicate any historical literacy. And if it was indeed supposed to be a parody, that just makes it a very weird vehicle to tell such a serious story as it attempts to do. For one, no one on Earth would download anything from the internet, let alone a whole ass video game, in 5 seconds in that time period. And why is there a visual novel parody game in this guy's PC? It's not like there weren't super silly novels by that time, but the way it's presented is such a 2010s era trope. It feels like Namco High rather than being something that could accurately depict the era while featuring humor that would have been included. I realize I'm being pedantic and sweating the small stuff, but this isn't a traditional FPS where killing other players is the point. This is hyper-focusing on such a specific niche aesthetic meant to communicate a niche feeling. But there's a lot of small things that scream the fact this was a 2010s created game. It's a car wreck representation of those feelings. Listen, I was born in 2001, but my family really didn't have the money to buy anything new when I showed up, so basically everything in the house was from the late 80s and early 90s. And even from the few moments I can recollect of messing around with old computers and playing games from that era, No Players Online is too ingrained with being a haunted PS1, so retro game jam entry to ever match that even slightly. Maybe I'm being too harsh and placing too much stock on it being a 90s styled experience, but the flimsiness is what sells it down the river for me. Why even lean into this so predominantly if you're not going to follow through? I certainly didn't find the narrative engaging enough to make up for it. I would be shocked if any 90s baby felt nostalgia or familiarity with this. I would be delighted if this were just a glorified walking sim, because that's what the original was, for all its flaws. The 2019 version was a far tighter experience because it was able to imply so much more about its era without going into extraneous, disastrous detail. It lets the player absorb the atmosphere of the game within the game, and uses more mechanics to demonstrate an accuracy in representing what it feels like to retrospectively contemplate a video game. So the 2025 version wants to have its cake and eat it too. There are a lot of games being made now that can accurately represent an older era of video games, but can also provide the experience of playing through a completely abandoned or even haunted game with much more finesse and focus. It's a motif that I feel very strongly about. So if you're serious about capturing that vibe, look anywhere else other than here. The intention to expand left what feels like the selling point out to dry, and I've seen plenty of people heap praise on the story, so clearly it did stick the landing for lots. But it was worse than just a misfire for me. It torpedoed the entire project. I guess the team just wanted to take a different approach, and they wanted to expand out to encompass more technology than just the game. But turning 15 minutes into a flavorless 2-hour mess made the whole project look like a thin, bland slab of hardtack. I'm not interested in making fun of anyone who likes this game or shaming anyone who worked on it. They worked their asses off, and I'm glad there are a million YouTube videos explaining the ARG. They deserve to be rewarded with stacking paper and getting coverage. Oh, yeah, the ARG. There's some kind of alternate reality game attached to this project, but I'm not touching that. Listen, I have too much on my plate every day to cover the hidden lore of a story I already didn't like. I really don't have time for ARG coverage these days, and the already present narrative really didn't interest me enough to go sleuthing for exact details on how Sarah became a ghost or whatever. I'm just kind of puzzled what their intention was here. So it started off as a 2019 kind of haunted video game psychological horror demo, and then they marketed the $20 Steam version as the same thing, and then they rug pull you like, JK, it's actually a whiny melodrama. Okay, clearly people like it, that's fine, just I don't get it. Oh boy, this is a big one. I'm not sure if this is coming as a surprise for some, but I've actually never played a Resident Evil game as of writing the script. Maybe I'm a poser, or I guess I'm LARPing, as kids like to say. Even though I'm expressing these statements online and not physically, so the live action part of the acronym doesn't even apply. Words lost their meaning a long time ago. We live in a post-definition state where all words are dictated by fleeting vibes. You know what the series is about. It quite literally invented survival horror as a genre and kicked off a wave of third-person horror shooter copycats in the 90s. And then kicked off a wave of copycat third-person shooters in the 2010s and 2020s, but with even less shame. That is to say, the series insists upon itself, but from what I've gathered, it kind of ran into an issue starting around Resi 4, which gave the property a noticeable action game with horror elements shift. Come Resi 5, and especially Resi 6, people felt like the mainline series completely abandoned the actual horror aspects in favor of flashy spectacles rather than scares. Resi 6 has its fans, and it still sold enough copies to take Capcom off suicide watch, but you could feel a real hesitation in the company after 6's troubled development and mixed critical reception. There was a far longer development window between Resi 6 and the next installment, only matched by the gap between 3 and 4, which was when the first shift in development priorities came, so I can easily apply a retroactive gestation and reevaluation of what Resident Evil should be in that time frame. January of 2017 was graced with Resident Evil 7 Biohazard, a title that changed the series' identity so radically I'm surprised they even called it Resi 7 at points. Even as someone who had never played the games, I could see the stunned reactions of longtime fans and experience the revival of the series as a horror icon through watching Jev play it nearly a decade ago. There's always been people in the millions waiting for the next entry to come out, but you could feel the static in the air with this one. People were excited in a way that totally dwarfed anything that came before it. This is my first real foray into Resi as a franchise, so if I accidentally upset a longtime fan by saying something stupid, leave a comment down below, but I won't read it. Resident Evil is the poster child for third-person horror games, so much so that you don't even need to play them to know that by cultural osmosis. So imagine my surprise to see that Capcom quite literally changed perspectives. They went from third to first, something they've never done before with the series. Actually, that's not true at all. There are a couple of first-person spin-offs, but everyone I've spoken to about them pretends they don't exist. Apparently most of them are awful and don't play like traditional Resi whatsoever, so I'm gonna leave Resident Evil Survivor alone, for now. This wasn't just a mere stylistic choice. The first-person perspective of the brand new character, Ethan Winters, is a radical shift that represents only one cell of a greater nervous system that makes up the body of the game. Taking focus away from the protagonist's character model allows for the environments to take center stage, which is something Capcom directs to the player by having the first 30 to 40 minutes of this game act as almost a short film that not only introduces us to basic gameplay, but encapsulates and distills the core mechanics into an easily digestible demo to convince anyone to play further. Ethan travels out to a dilapidated old estate belonging to the reclusive and ominous Baker family when he receives a letter from his long-missing wife, Mia, to come rescue her. There is very little combat or puzzle solving. I was shocked to experience how closely this intro plays to something like Outlast or Penumbra. The estate is utterly depraved and wretched. Trash lines the walls, insects and parasites writhe throughout spoiled food. Ethan feels like a crime scene surveyor exploring the ruins of a once great family mansion now marked for demolition. I can almost taste that disgusting, soggy smell of mold and rotten flesh and dried batteries all throughout the home. Capcom put immense care into depicting not just the obvious neglectful strokes of a broken home, but the hyper-specific idiosyncrasies of it too. There were so many containers left by the wayside that I swear every broken family has. The fact there's unmolested notes taped everywhere while the house is rotting off the foundation really takes me back. I remember being a kid and going to friends' houses that kind of looked like this. Except there weren't any crow heads in microwaves. That one is new. But that isn't to say the world outside the Baker residence isn't just as vivid. Resi 7 is a prime example of the Southern Gothic genre. The game takes place around the New Orleans area, with all the staples of the genre. Poverty, familial relations, giant nasty bugs in a swamp. It's got it all. From the first cutscene of Ethan getting out of his car, it recreates the tense and breathtaking scene of Rust and Hart arriving at Ledoux's place from True Detective Season 1, which is considerable praise. This also distinguishes the Baker estate as not just an old spooky farm out in the middle of the woods, but a spooky Louisiana farm out in the woods. There's so much fascinating Americana lining these dirty walls. It's like getting to visit a museum while also running for your life at the same time. Civil War sculptures, old school football helmets, so many outdated family pictures. These walls are talking, I'm writing down what they're saying. The act of surveying a location as a stranger is so integral to the new gameplay style that the game actually opens on watching a video on a laptop and having a mini sequence where we temporarily take control of a cameraman exploring the Baker residence once Ethan finds an old VHS tape. Everything is so tightly screwed into place to make you feel like a foreign, corner-creeping invader exploring a place you really shouldn't be in. We find Mia, but clearly something is wrong with her and we need to start swinging. Our immediate introduction to combat, which really isn't dissimilar to how it plays out in the original series from what I understand. Handhelds and firearms are scattered throughout the mansion and all have their ups and downs for range, damage, resources. I don't think I'm blowing anyone's mind when I tell them you're going to have to not only find ammo when you get a gun, but look for secret reserves of it too to make more consistent use of it than just being a used spot in your inventory. Oh, yeah, inventory management. We have a very limited amount of those spots, which means you'll inevitably run into scenarios where you simply can't pick up required story items and have to manage your pockets to the best of your ability. Sure as hell makes things harder than the earlier Silent Hill games. It isn't long till we're taken prisoner by the Baker family themselves as they drag us away from the guest house and into the game proper. And what a treat these lot are. As if being held hostage by a hick house family out in the bayou wasn't scary enough, they're all on some kind of immortality maker's mark that allows them to fully regenerate severed limbs in their entire skulls after being blown apart, making your weaponry only able to stun them, but never kill them. Resident Evil is infamous for its chaser-type enemies, these big lumbering monsters that would follow you throughout certain sections of the map that were best avoided. And Jack Baker, our chaser for the evening, brings this concept to its logical conclusion by making this big freaky hick that chases you all throughout the narrow hallways of his house. So you're never safe from meeting the business end of his new hickey. It feels different from being chased by a big ugly monster that wants to kill you. Jack has somewhat of a brain and uses the house's layout against you to catch you off guard. Hiding from him is best approached by alley-ooping him around a corner while you close doors behind you as you either scamper to another part of the home or enter one of the few safe rooms scattered around, which allows you to save your game and store some items in these safe chests for further use while not getting your hand severed. Jack always kept me on my toes because he would block required areas you must pass through, so learning how to deal with him is inevitable. I usually give him a headshot or two and just dash to another floor of the house, but you can absolutely cheese him without too much of a hassle. Peering at him around the corner, watching him sulk about and call Ethan's name made my heart jump on more than one single occasion. The anticipation of these chases is heavy, but never overwhelming enough to be a ridiculous roadblock. But there was always a way around him, even if it was terrifying to engage with. I don't know how they did it, but they managed to make the Baker family such an impressive balance of terrifying, but also hilarious.
Yes!
Hit boy's got to eat. He got to have his supper. Come here, boy. Let's do this. Come on.
All the black mold in their house has putrefied their brains to the bare essentials, but the reality of the situation clung to me like nicotine on a smoking jacket. Ethan is being chased by this psychotic hillbilly shouting, "Sweet!" who wants to force feed him Arby's or whatever that is. The Baker family has multiple adult children still living with them. That's about as southern as it gets. Getting caught by Jack isn't an instant death. He gets in your face and attacks you, but you can guard with the spacebar key against his melee attacks, so there's a very generous amount of times you can survive a blow from him before death. The only thing I solidly dislike about Jack as a pursuer, other than the fact that he'll sometimes just guard the only entryway into an area and force you into an encounter and sort of break that illusion of him having an independent schedule, is how sprint shy Ethan is. Can you even tell I'm running? He looks like he's walking around a flea market, not running for his life. Ethan should not be able to easily outpace anyone, but geez, running away is barely a real option with how unremarkable his top speed is there. Makes me question if sprinting was included for any reason other than obligation. You can't dodge anything either, but there's this ultra awkward repositioning button in the form of X on the keyboard to instantly flip around, which should really remind you this is an FPS game made in Japan. On one hand, forcing you to get up close is a commendable move to keep the perspective relevant, but on the other hand that's being held together by staples, I find the guidelines sometimes awkwardly followed. The approach of getting your hands dirty even extends to the HUD, or the lack of it I should say. Your health bar comes from the form of this wristwatch Ethan has that's only visible when you access your inventory, which is in real time, so anything aside from the main menu doesn't grant you safety or relief from the horrors. I really wanted to praise this game for having such an ergonomic and non-intrusive health bar and HUD, but they kinda walk it back by smearing COD jam all over the screen whenever you get hit, which I think is totally unnecessary, even if I begrudgingly understand why it was included. You can't even remove it in the options menu, it's a permanent feature. Of course, being chased is hardly the only activity in the Baker residence. Their house is conveniently equipped with more than a few puzzles to solve, most of which involve finding items in one part of the house and bringing them to another, which is obviously made more complicated by having not only Jack, but other conspicuous mold monsters show up to greet you with a bite through the jugular. These tasks aren't as straightforward as bring a key from upstairs downstairs, it's bring a key from upstairs downstairs while killing half a dozen moldy boys and evading Jack and noticing something missing from the room you were just in that will come up later. There are more than enough moving parts to make these tasks consistently interesting without feeling like cookie-cutter fetch quests. The puzzle solving strikes a reasonable balance between being very simple to comprehend without being so stripped down that it feels pointless to engage with. Resident Evil's status as the biggest horror game franchise of all time is taken into consideration with the puzzles, because most of them are not very challenging, but still demand basic reading comprehension and a little outside the box thinking, like using this piece of metal to make the shape of an eagle to project a shadow against a painting. You'd think that'd be an unremarkable mention, but believe me, basic reading comprehension and outside-the-box thinking are rare these days. I didn't mind dealing with Jack since there was more than one way to skin a cat in his case, but running away from the average enemy is not really an option. You have to stand your ground as much as you can, which I never found all that engaging because I swear everything takes a million hits to kill. Obviously, I'm not using an all that strong weapon at the moment, but you really have to take your time in getting stronger stuff, so you end up stuck with crap a lot of the times, or no resources to support said crap to the crafting system. The crafting system is as simple as finding two items and putting them together to make bullets or healing items or whatever. It mostly relies on what you find at the moment and the space in your inventory, but the early game search for bullets feels like searching for the meaning of life. It's exhausting. It takes like 4 to 5 headshots to kill one mold guy in the basement here. God forbid you whiff and shoot him in the body or miss altogether. The same buffers you can use against Jack still apply here thankfully, but the tug-of-war combat with mooks really doesn't carry the same electricity as it does with him for me. Ethan struggles a little too much against the average monster than I feel he reasonably should. Not that he should be overpowered, but I feel like there was definitely some overcorrecting from Resi 6 being a borderline Bollywood action flick in the DNA of this game's combat. Slashing at someone pillar to post doesn't bring me the same relief of stomping a monster's head in Silent Hill to finish it off. Resident Evil 7 falls into a routine pretty early on. You unlock more sections of the house, find more locked doors and puzzles to solve, and evade Jack while keeping track of safe rooms, items, crafting, your health, etc. The micromanaging kept the repetition engaging and not tiresome, but I did sometimes groan at seeing Jack pop up when I just wanted to get a puzzle done and move on. This is hardly the only game that does this. Outlast chase sequences can get pretty tiresome, but I hope you get where I'm coming from. Resident Evil 7 is a game that's designed to be replayed over and over, and this is still a cursory explanation of the beginning 3 or 4 hours of the game. The story is still chugging along at a medium pace here. As a newcomer to the franchise, I'm confident more seasoned players are going to poke some holes in what I have to say, and I think the world has more than enough people explaining why they love the series, so I think I'll take the road less traveled and simply leave it at that. Resident Evil 7 is so engaging and just clicked in all the places it really needed to. I have no doubts I'll be completing this one on my own time after the video's done. It's almost universally agreed that it was what the franchise needed, a soft reboot to get things back on the right track, and it feels a little disconnected from every other game from my point of view. 8 looks like it directly continues Ethan's story, but leans more into action combat and even has a third-person mode included with DLC, and Resident Evil 9 freely allows you to switch between first and third person as you wish, so 7 being first person only makes it stand out as a much more focused and insular project in my mind. Kinda makes me question what the priorities for those later 2 games were compared to the first. I can confidently say I'm a lot more interested in clicking play on that multitude of Resident Evil games I have collecting virtual dust in my Steam library that I've acquired from bundles throughout the years. How long did this video end up? Oh geez. Obviously, this is a genre I've spent a lot of time in, playing games across multiple decades at all varying degrees of scares and shoots. Some games have been an absolute treat to replay. Some I feel haven't measured up to how I remembered them, and the ones I've played for the first time have been a joy to compare and contrast. I ended up playing an enormous amount of games for this project, some of which couldn't be included for various reasons. I simply could not get this game last rights to record on OBS under any circumstances. Look at how it pops in and out of existence. I have no idea why it's doing that, and I haven't been able to fix it. Shame, because I had a lot to say. This was already an exhaustive video. But there were plenty of other games I considered covering, but instead tucked away for an eventual sequel on the topic. And I have no doubt that I will be getting furious recommendations on what to look at next, which I always appreciate. I have to end it here before things get even more out of hand, unless you're watching this on Patreon, because I'm covering a couple extra games there. But for everyone on YouTube, our journey ends here. Let me know how you feel about these grab bag type videos. They're very fun to make. But until then, have a lovely rest of your day.